Okay, so this is going to sound completely insane, and honestly, even now, years later, writing it down makes my hands sweat. I've never really talked about this to anyone except for David and Raoul, and even with them, we kind of just acknowledged it and then moved on. Like some things are just too weird to keep digging at, but maybe putting it out there will help, I don't know. Probably not. It was February 2009. I was in Oakhaven, Alabama for a business thing. Some analyst gig, reviewing processes at some tech company out by the edge of town, near this big patch of woods. Nothing exciting, just your typical corporate grind. I was stuck in the Grand Oakhaven Hotel. Grand was definitely pushing it, by the way. It was more like moderately okay Oakhaven Hotel. 6th floor. The air in that room was always stuffy, no matter what I did with the thermostat. Made me feel claustrophobic. So one morning, it was probably around 6 a.m., still darkish, but that pre-dawn light starting to creep in. I was wide awake. Jet lag or something, I don't know. I couldn't sleep anymore, so I figured coffee and fresh air. I went out onto the balcony. It was freezing, like that sharp Alabama winter cold that cuts right through you. But the air was cleaner out there, smelled like pine and damp earth. I leaned on the railing, steaming coffee in hand, just looking out. Below, there was the hotel parking lot, then this road, and then just woods. Thick, tangled woods. Supposedly it was public land, some kind of small state park, according to the little brochure in the room. Beyond that, I could just make out the outlines of what I assumed was the Space and Technology Center. Looked like a bunch of low, grey buildings. It was quiet, except for the hum of some distant traffic, and the occasional bird chirping up somewhere in the trees. Peaceful, for about 30 seconds, then I saw it. At first, I thought it was a deer. You know, sometimes they wander into weird places. But it was too big, way too big. It was coming out of the trees right at the edge of the woods, maybe 50 yards away from the hotel grounds. It moved slow, deliberate, and it was tall, like ridiculously tall. I remember freezing, coffee cup halfway to my mouth. I squinted, thinking my eyes were still adjusting to the low light. It stepped fully out of the trees and into this little clearing, and I saw it, really saw it. This thing, it was massive, easily 6, maybe 7 feet tall, solid muscle, covered in hair, but not like bear hair or anything. It was dark grey, almost black in the dim light, and it looked coarse, like tangled wire. And the way it moved, it wasn't like an animal. It was upright, walking on 2 legs, but it had this weird, rocking motion, like it was slightly off balance with each step. And the face, that's what messed me up the most. It wasn't an animal face, not really. It was human-like, broad, flat nose, low forehead, but definitely human features. But twisted, wrong somehow. The eyes were deep set, and even from that distance I could tell they were dark. So dark they seemed to suck in the little light that was there. It just stood there at the edge of the woods, facing, not really at me, but kind of in my direction. Like it was looking towards the hotel, but not focusing on anything specific. Just observing and rocking, slowly, back and forth, back and forth. My heart started pounding. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't a bear. This wasn't a deer. This wasn't anything I'd ever seen or imagined. It looked prehistoric, like something out of a bad movie about cavemen, but way more real, way more terrifying. Fear. That's the only thing I can describe feeling. Pure, cold, primal fear. The kind that makes your blood run cold and your muscles lock up. I wanted to scream, to shout for someone, anyone. But I couldn't move, couldn't make a sound. I just stood there, frozen, staring at this thing. It rocked for what felt like forever, maybe only a minute or two. Then slowly, it turned its head, just a fraction, towards the trees to its left. And then it just walked back into the woods, step by slow, deliberate step, disappearing into the shadows like it was fading into smoke. 1 second it was there, huge and solid. The next, just gone. swallowed by the trees. I stood there on the balcony, shaking. My coffee was cold, my hands were clammy, I had to blink a few times to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. Did that just happen? Was I dreaming? But the cold air biting at my skin, the racing heart, the sheer lingering terror, that was all real. I backed slowly into my room, shut the balcony door and locked it. Then I just stood there in the middle of the room, looking at the door like it was going to burst open. My mind was racing. What the hell was that? Was it some kind of crazy homeless person? But no. The size, the hair, the face. It wasn't human. Not entirely. I knew I couldn't just ignore it. I couldn't pretend I hadn't seen what I'd seen. So, I did the only thing I could think of. I called down to the front desk and asked for security. Said I thought I saw something strange outside. Tried to sound calm, rational, even though my voice was probably trembling. Within minutes, there was a knock at my door. 2 guys in hotel security uniforms, David and Raoul. Young guys, probably bored out of their minds most of the time. I told them what I'd seen, stumbling over my words, trying to explain about the giant, hairy, human-faced thing in the woods. They exchanged a look, skeptical. I knew I sounded like a crazy person. "Sir, are you sure you were feeling all right?" David asked, trying to keep a straight face. "Look, I know what I saw," I said, frustration creeping into my voice. "Just come out onto the balcony with me. You can see for yourselves." They shrugged, but they followed me back out onto the balcony. I pointed towards the woods. "Right there, just at the edge. Did you see anything?" They looked. They squinted. "Sir, I don't see anything," Raoul said finally. David nodded in agreement. I felt my stomach drop. Of course not. It was gone, vanished without a trace. But it was just there, I insisted. It was huge, like bigger than a bear, covered in dark hair, and its face, it looked almost human. David tried to placate me. "Maybe it was just a big guy in a costume, sir. You know, early morning jogger or something." "A costume that looks like that?" I said, exasperated. "And jogging at 6 in the morning in the freezing cold? And that tall? Come on." They were still clearly unconvinced, but I could see a flicker of curiosity in their eyes. Maybe they were humoring me. "Okay, sir," David said slowly. "Let's just take a walk around, see if we can find anything." So we went downstairs, out the back entrance of the hotel, towards the edge of the property, closer to the woods. It was fully light out now, the sun starting to peek over the horizon. The air was still cold, and the ground was damp. We walked along the edge of the woods. Nothing, just trees and undergrowth. I was starting to feel like a complete idiot. Maybe I had imagined it. Stress, bad coffee, maybe that stuffy room was getting to my head. Then Raoul stopped. He pointed to a pine tree just inside the tree line. "Hey, what's that?" We walked over, and there it was. Fresh bark, ripped clean off the side of the pine tree. Big chunks of wood torn away, exposing the raw, pale wood underneath. It looked like something massive had clawed at it. David whistled. "Damn! That's something." We kept walking. A few feet further into the woods, the ground got softer, muddier. And then we saw them. Footprints. Huge footprints. Deep impressions in the mud. Much bigger than any human foot or any animal foot I'd ever seen. They were wide and long, with what looked like distinct toes, but not like bear tracks, not like deer tracks. These were massive and strangely shaped, like a human foot, but wrong, distorted, gigantic. David and Raoul stared at the tracks, their skepticism starting to fade. They followed the footprints a few steps into the woods. "They're going that way," Raoul muttered, pointing deeper into the trees. We followed the tracks for maybe 20 feet, and then we smelled it. A stench, foul, musky, and sickly sweet at the same time, like something rotting mixed with berries. David wrinkled his nose. "Jesus, what is that smell?" We looked around. And then we saw it. A massive pile of scat, animal droppings. But on a scale I couldn't believe. It was huge, like something you'd expect from an elephant, not something that could just be wandering around these woods outside a hotel. And the smell, it was overpowering. David cautiously poked at it with a stick. He recoiled instantly. "Berries," he said, his face pale. "And seeds? What the hell kind of animal eats this much berries and stuff?" We all just stared at the scat, at the footprints, at the ripped bark. The silence stretched out, heavy and thick with unspoken questions. The early morning birds didn't seem to be chirping anymore. The woods suddenly felt different, menacing. The initial fear I felt on the balcony was coming back, stronger now. It wasn't just a fleeting glimpse of something strange anymore. There was evidence. Physical, undeniable evidence that something massive, something unknown, had been right there, just outside the hotel. "Okay," David said finally, his voice quiet. "Okay, sir. I believe you now." Raoul nodded, his eyes wide. We went back inside, walked through the hotel lobby in silence. No one said anything more about it. We just went back to our jobs. David and Raoul went back to security. I went back to my stuffy sixth-floor room. But the image of that thing, the smell of the scat, the feeling of dread, it stayed with me all day. I tried to work, tried to focus on spreadsheets and presentations, but my mind kept drifting back to the woods, to the creature. What was it? Where did it come from? Was it still out there? That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the hotel, every rustle of leaves outside made me jump. I kept imagining those dark eyes, that rocking motion, that disturbing human-like face. The next morning, I checked out early, got out of Oakhaven as fast as I could. I didn't tell anyone at work about it. I didn't tell my family, just buried it, tried to forget it. But you don't forget something like that. Not really. Sometimes late at night when it's quiet and dark, I still think about it. I still see that thing in my mind. And I wonder, what was it? What the hell did I see out there in the woods that morning? And sometimes, I wonder if it's still there, rocking, watching, waiting in the shadows at the edge of civilization. I really hope I never find out. I really, really hope not. Story 2. It was early May 2016, and I remember because the fishing season had just opened up for some of the higher lakes. My buddy Alan, who's usually more of a city guy, had somehow gotten talked into coming along with me up to Pinetop Junction. Now, I've been around these woods my whole life. Hunting, fishing, camping, you name it. Grew up in a cabin my dad built himself a few miles outside of town, and I've seen my share of wildlife, from bears to mountain lions. Nothing really rattles me out here, or at least nothing ever had before that morning. We were heading up to a lake I knew tucked back on a logging road, one of those places you gotta know where you're going, because there's no cell service and barely a trail at points. Fog was thick as pea soup that morning, the kind that hangs low and wet, making everything feel damp and muted. Alan was already on edge, I could tell. He hates fog, says it makes him nervous. He was in the passenger seat, white-knuckling the door handle as I navigated the old Ford pickup around another bend in the road. We were going slow, maybe 20 miles an hour. Visibility was that bad. And then it happened. Alan just yelled, plain as day, "Bob, hold up! What the hell is that?" I slammed on the brakes, tires crunching on the gravel shoulder. "What? What's wrong?" I asked, my heart starting to pick up speed because Alan doesn't usually get that worked up. He pointed out the passenger window, his finger shaking. "Over there, by the road. Look." I squinted through the fog, trying to see what had spooked him so bad. At first it just looked like a dark, hunched shape near the ditch beside the road, kind of blurry through the mist. My first thought, honestly, was just some big dog or maybe even a bear cub. You get all kinds of critters wandering onto the roads around here. But as we got a little closer, rolling forward slowly, my gut started to clench up. It didn't look like a dog. And it sure as hell didn't look like any bear cub I'd ever seen. It was crouched down low, right there on the edge of the trees, almost like it was hiding or watching. As the truck crept closer, I could make out more details, and that's when the first real wave of unease hit me. This wasn't any animal I recognized. It was covered in fur, coarse and black, matted looking, like it hadn't been groomed in, well, ever. The way it was built, crouched down as it was just off. It was low to the ground, but broad-shouldered, if you could even call them shoulders on something built like that. And the arms, God, those arms were long, even bent at the elbows, resting on the ground as it crouched. They looked way too long for its body. It was like its arms were meant for something else, something, I don't know, more like climbing than walking. As we got even closer, maybe 15 feet away now, I could see its head better, and that's when the hair on the back of my neck really started to stand up. It had a brow ridge, heavy and jutting out over its eyes, like one of those Neanderthal skulls you see in museums. No real neck to speak of, just head slung low between those wide shoulders, practically resting on its chest. And the face. It was hard to make out clearly in the fog and the shadows, but I could see it had a flat nose, almost pushed into its face, and these deep-set eyes, dark and intense. It was facing away from us, but then, slowly, it started to turn its head. Not the whole body, just the head, twisting around on its thick fur-covered shoulders. And those eyes locked right onto us. They were dark, I said, but they were also bright, like something burning behind them. Intelligent. That's the only word for it. It wasn't like looking into the eyes of a deer or even a wolf. This was something else, something that was looking back at us and understanding. I've hunted deer, elk, even bear a few times in my life. You look in their eyes, you see animal instinct, fear, maybe curiosity. But these eyes, there was something else there. Something calculating. Almost human, but not human either. Wrong kind of human. Primal, maybe. It was still crouched, maybe about 3 feet tall in that position, but it looked solid, powerful, and the fur, it just kept catching my eye. So thick and black, it seemed to absorb the light, making it even harder to make out the details of its body. Except for the arms, those long, unsettling arms. We sat there in the truck, engine idling, just staring at this thing. Neither of us said anything for a long minute, maybe longer. It was like we were both frozen, just trying to process what we were seeing. I felt this coldness creeping into my gut, a feeling I hadn't felt since I was a kid hearing ghost stories around a campfire. This was something way outside my comfort zone, outside anything I understood about the natural world. Then it moved, and it was the weirdest, most unsettling thing it did. It reached out one of those long arms, and its hand, I could see it clearly now because it extended it out from its body, picked something up from the ground, something right by its crouched feet, in the gravel by the side of the road, and it raised it up and dropped it. It was trash, just a crumpled-up piece of something, looked like a candy wrapper or something similar, glinting faintly in the dull light. It picked it up, just like a person would, and just dropped it back down. Not like it was eating it or examining it, just picked it up and dropped it. And that's when I saw its hand clearly. And that's what really made my blood run cold. It had a thumb, a distinct, opposable thumb, sticking out to the side of its hand, and four fingers and a thumb, just like a human hand, except it was covered in that coarse black fur too, and the fingers looked long, too long, but the shape, the way it picked up that piece of trash, it was a hand that wasn't human, but close enough to make you want to throw up. Alan finally found his voice then, a low whisper that was almost lost in the fog-muffled silence. Did you see that? I nodded, not trusting my own voice to work. My mouth was suddenly dry as cotton. What was that? He asked, his voice still shaky. I shook my head again. I don't know, Alan. I honest to God have no idea. And that was the truth. I've seen a lot of things in these woods, like I said, but nothing, absolutely nothing like this. Alan was looking at me, his eyes wide with a kind of fear I'd never seen on him before. You don't think it's one of those things, do you? I frowned, trying to figure out what he was talking about. Those things? What things? You know, he whispered, leaning closer like he was afraid of being overheard, even though there wasn't another soul for miles. The wild men, the stories. I scoffed, even though I didn't feel like scoffing at all. Not anymore. Alan, come on. Wild men. You talking about Bigfoot or something? That's just stories, man. Kids stuff. No, I'm serious, Bob. My grandpa used to tell stories about them, from up around here. Said the old-timers in Pinetop talked about them all the time back in the day. Wild men in the woods, covered in fur, living off the land. Said they were fast and strong, and they watched you from the trees. He was getting more and more worked up, his voice rising a little despite the whispers. I could see he was genuinely terrified, and honestly, I wasn't feeling too far off from scared myself at that point. Those stories, I'd heard them too growing up. Local legends, mostly dismissed as tall tales by anyone with any sense. But seeing that thing by the road, it was hard to just dismiss them now. It felt too real, too damn real. I tried to stay pragmatic, the way I always tried to be in the woods. Alan, it's probably just some kind of, I don't know, deformed bear or something. Some kind of animal we've never seen before. There's got to be a rational explanation. But even as I said it, I didn't believe it. Deformed bear, with hands like that, and eyes that looked at you like that. It didn't add up, not even close. The creature was still crouched there, head turned, those dark eyes fixed on us. It hadn't moved except to pick up and drop that piece of trash. It was just watching, and that was maybe the scariest part of all. It felt like it was studying us, observing us, the way you might watch ants crawling around on a log. I couldn't take it anymore. The fog, the silence, the creature, those eyes. It was all pressing in on me, making my chest tight and my breath shallow. I had to get out of there. "Okay, Alan," I said, my voice sounding rougher than I wanted it to. "We're going. Right now. Let's just go." He didn't argue. He was already pulling himself as far back against the passenger door as he could get. I slowly put the truck in drive, my hands shaking a little on the steering wheel. I didn't want to spook it, whatever it was. I didn't know what it would do if we startled it, and frankly, I didn't want to find out. I eased my foot off the brake and the truck started to roll forward again, slowly. I kept my eyes on the creature as we moved, not wanting to take them off it for a second. It stayed crouched there, head turned, watching us. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just watched. We crept past it, maybe 10 feet away now. 5, still watching. Then we were past it. I didn't speed up right away, just kept going slow, my heart pounding in my chest, feeling like it was trying to break free from my ribs. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw it still there, a dark shape crouched by the side of the road, in the fog, still watching. I drove like that for another mile, maybe 2, before I finally started to breathe a little easier. The fog started to thin out as we gained a little elevation, and the sun was trying to break through, casting long, hazy rays through the trees. I pulled over to the side of the road finally and turned off the engine. Silence. Just the sounds of the woods, birds chirping, the rustle of leaves in the faint breeze. But it felt different now. Heavy. Charged. Like something had shifted in the air, something had changed. Alan was still pale, breathing heavily. He finally looked over at me, his eyes still wide. What the hell was that, Bob?" he repeated, his voice still shaky. I just shook my head again, running a hand over my face. "I don't know, Alan. I really don't know." And I didn't. And I still don't. We didn't go fishing that day. We turned around and went straight back home. Alan was adamant about it, and honestly, I didn't argue. The thought of spending the day out in those woods, knowing that thing, whatever it was, might be out there, it just didn't sit right with me anymore. The woods didn't feel the same. They felt watched. We never talked about it much after that. Alan doesn't come out to the woods with me anymore. Says he's had his fill of nature. We both just kind of pushed it to the back of our minds, tried to forget it ever happened, but I haven't forgotten, and I don't think I ever will. Every time I drive that road, especially if it's foggy, I find myself slowing down, looking over to the side of the road, expecting to see it again, waiting to see those dark eyes watching me from the shadows. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying in bed in the dark, I think about those eyes, and that hand, and the way it just picked up that piece of trash and dropped it, like it was mimicking something, or making a statement. I don't know what it was we saw that day. I still try to rationalize it, to find some explanation that fits within the world I understand. But deep down I know we saw something we weren't supposed to see, something that lives out there in the woods, something else. And I'm not sure we were meant to survive the encounter. It just let us go. And that's the part that really chills me to the bone. Why did it let us go? And will we see it again? I don't know. And I really, really don't want to find out. That's all I got. That's what happened that day. And to this day, I can't explain it. Story 3. Okay, so, you guys ever heard of Reelfoot Lake? Probably not unless you're from around Tennessee. Even then, maybe you've only heard stories. It's different there. Always has been. My grandma used to say the lake was made by an earthquake, 'cause the Mississippi River got fed up and decided to change course or something. Sounded like a tall tale when I was a kid. But being there, you kind of felt like anything could happen, you know? Like the world's rules were a bit bendy around those parts. I grew up in Glass Community, just spitting distance from the lake. Glass Community. Fancy name, right? It was just a bunch of houses scattered around, mostly folks who'd been there for generations. Everyone knew everyone, and everyone knew about the white thing. That wasn't exactly the kind of thing they taught you in school, but you learned about it real quick. It was like part of the air we breathed out there. Whispers at church potlucks, hushed tones when the grown-ups thought we weren't listening, warnings whispered right before dark. The white thing. Just hearing the name made your skin prickle. They said it was dingy white, like if Bigfoot got bleached and then rolled around in mud that wasn't quite mud anymore, but something grimy. Bigfoot, yeah, that's the closest anyone could ever come to describing it. Except off. Wrong somehow. They said it stank, like something rotting but also kind of animal. And it walked upright like a man, but too tall, too bulky. And its eyes, they said its eyes were just gone. Empty black holes where eyes should be. But that might have just been stories getting taller with each telling, you know how it is. When I was a kid, I thought it was all just that, stories. Something to scare kids into behaving, to keep us out of the woods after dark. I was a typical kid, wanted to prove I wasn't scared of anything. Me and my friends, we'd dare each other to go closer to the woods at night, holding our breath and running back, giggling like idiots. Then came the hide-and-seek game. We were playing in Miller's Field. Big field, long grass, corn stalks at the edges. Perfect for hiding. It was getting dusky, you know, that time when the shadows stretch out real long and everything starts to look a little weird. I was hiding behind this big stack of hay bales, felt all clever 'cause I was pretty sure no one would find me. I could hear the other kids yelling and laughing, getting closer, and then it all changed. Suddenly, the laughter stopped. Dead. Just gone. Then came screams. Not playful screams, not the kind you make when you're tagged. These were real, terrified. I peeked out from behind the hay bales, heart pounding. I saw them, my friends. They were running like their lives depended on it. Faces white, mouths wide open, Silent screams, because they were too scared to even make a sound. Just tearing across that field. I didn't see what they were running from. Didn't need to. Their faces, that was enough. Something was terrifying them. Something real. And whatever it was behind them, chasing them. I didn't wait to see what it was, didn't wait to figure anything out. I just ran with them, my little legs pumping as fast as they could. I could hear their panicked breathing, the thud of their feet on the ground, and something else, something heavy, like something big, moving fast through the tall grass, crashing through it. We didn't stop running until we were back in someone's yard, huddled together, panting, crying, shaking. No one talked about what we'd seen or what we thought we'd seen. We didn't have to. We all knew. Something had scared us, something big and unseen. That was the first time. The first time the white thing stopped being just a story for me. It became a feeling, a cold, tight knot in my gut. Years went by. We grew up. The hide-and-seek thing. It became one of those stories we'd tell sometimes, a nervous laugh. Remember that time we all freaked out in Miller's Field? But under the surface, it was always there, that little seed of fear. I was staying at my cousin's place one summer. He lived closer to the woods, out on the edge of the community. His house was old, big windows, creaky floors. The kind of place that always felt a little bit haunted even in the daytime. We were up late, watching some old monster movie on TV, probably something cheesy like Creature from the Black Lagoon, making popcorn, laughing, regular teenager stuff. Then my cousin's little sister, Sarah, she just froze, staring at the window. We asked her what was wrong, figured she was just messing around, trying to scare us. But she didn't say anything. Just kept staring, eyes wide, mouth slightly open. Then she pointed, slowly, like she was afraid to even move her arm too fast. We followed her finger, to the window, to the dark outside. Woods right up against the edge of their yard, black shadows under the trees, everything still and quiet. For a minute, I didn't see anything, just the dark. Then, movement. Something pale, way out in the trees, but not far, just at the edge of the light spilling from the window. It was big, taller than a man for sure, and wide, a hulking shape, just barely visible in the shadows. Off-white like dirty snow, it was just standing there, motionless, watching the house, I swear to God, watching us. We all saw it. My cousin, me, Sarah, even her older brother, who always acted like nothing scared him. We just stood there, frozen, staring at this thing in the dark, out in the trees. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just was. Then, slowly, it turned its head, just a little, like it had heard something, or maybe sensed us watching it. And that's when I saw, or thought I saw, the face, or where the face should be. Nothing, just darkness, like two holes cut in a pale mask, like no eyes at all. My cousin's older brother, he finally broke the silence, whispered like he was afraid of being overheard. The white thing, and that was it, the name, out loud, in the quiet of the night. It sounded heavy, real, scarier than any monster on TV. We backed away from the window, slowly, never taking our eyes off that dark shape in the trees. We shut the curtains, even though it felt stupid, like thin cloth could stop whatever that was. We turned on all the lights in the house, huddled together in the living room, talking in hushed voices until the sun came up. After that night, the white thing wasn't just a story anymore. It wasn't just a feeling, it was something you could see, something real that lived out there in the woods, watching. But even those times, those were just glimpses, like catching something out of the corner of your eye and wondering if you really saw it. The real encounter, the one that stuck with me, that happened a few years later. I was a teenager by then, maybe 16, 17. I'd gone into town with some friends, hanging out at the diner, usual Friday night stuff. It was late when I left to walk home. Town was a couple of miles from Glass Community, but I walked it all the time, didn't think anything of it. Road was mostly empty, just a few houses scattered along the way, streetlights buzzing softly, casting these weak yellow circles on the asphalt. Quiet night, crisp autumn air, stars were out, clear sky. Felt peaceful, almost. I was humming to myself, kicking a pebble down the road, lost in my own thoughts. Then I saw it, up ahead, in the road, right in the middle of the road, where the streetlight was shining down. At first, I thought it was a dog, a big dog, squatting down in the road. But then it moved, or shifted, and I saw it wasn't a dog. Too big, too wrong-shaped, and it was pale. So pale it almost glowed in the weak streetlight. I stopped walking, just stopped, staring, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It was squatting there, facing away from me, towards the woods on the other side of the road. Bent over, like it was doing something, rummaging in the grass by the side of the road. I don't know. My heart started to pound in my chest. That cold knot from when I was a kid. It was back, twisting in my gut. I knew what it was. Even before it turned, it was the white thing, no doubt, no question. It must have heard me stop, or sensed me. I don't know how those things work. But it turned its head, slowly, deliberately, and looked right at me. That's when I saw it full on, bathed in the streetlight. No more shadows, no more glimpses. Just there. Real. Terrifyingly real. It was huge. Bigger than I'd ever imagined. Taller than any man I'd ever seen. Broad shoulders, thick chest, long arms that hung almost to the ground. Covered in hair, fur, something like that. Dingy white. Yeah, dingy was the word for it. Like old stained snow. It was massive. Just a wall of something wrong. And the head, it was too small for the body, squashed looking. And the face, or the lack of it, that was the worst. The stories were right. No eyes, just holes. Black, empty sockets staring right at me, or where they should have been staring. It was like looking into nothingness, into the void. We just stared at each other, me and that thing, locked eyes, or locked, empty sockets, for what felt like forever. But it couldn't have been more than a few seconds. The air was thick, heavy, charged with something, fear, pure, raw terror. Yeah, that was it. It was radiating off of it, and I know it was radiating off of me too. Then it happened. We both broke. At the same time, mutual terror, like we were both surprised, horrified to see each other. It lurched back, stumbled back, its massive body moving faster than I thought possible. It turned and ran into the woods, crashing through the undergrowth, branches snapping, leaves rustling, a huge, heavy sound fading quickly into the dark trees. And I didn't think, didn't breathe, didn't even realize I was moving. I just ran, the other way, back towards town, running as fast as my legs would carry me, heart hammering, lungs burning, adrenaline screaming through my veins. I didn't stop running until I was back in town, under the bright lights of the diner, gasping for air, shaking so bad I could barely stand. I don't know how long I stayed there. Hours, maybe. Just sat in a booth, staring out the window at the empty street, waiting for the sun to come up. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen. Who would believe me, and what would they say? Yeah, Billy, we know about the white thing. Like it was just normal. I walked home in the daylight. Sun was bright, birds were singing, the road looked normal, peaceful, like nothing had ever happened. But everything was different. Everything felt tainted. The road, the trees, the shadows. I saw them all differently now. I knew what was out there. I knew it was real. That image, that's what stuck with me. The white thing, squatting in the road, turning, those empty eyes, the size of it, the sheer wrongness of it. It's burned into my memory like a brand. I can close my eyes right now and see it, clear as day, squatting there, waiting. I still live around here, in Glass Community. Everyone does, mostly. We're used to it, or we pretend to be. We still hear stories. Someone saw something in the woods, dogs barking at nothing, strange noises at night. The whispers are still there, the fear is still there, just under the surface, waiting. I don't walk home from town late anymore, ever. And when I drive at night, I keep my windows rolled up, doors locked, music turned down low, just in case. You never know, do you? You never know what's out there in the dark, just at the edge of the light, waiting, squatting in the road, turning. And sometimes, when I'm driving home late at night, on a dark stretch of road, when the headlights catch the edge of the woods, I get this feeling, this cold, tight knot in my gut, and I can't help but wonder, is it still out there? Watching, waiting, and if it's still out there, what does it want, and why? Why did it run away from me? Just like I ran away from it? That's the part I'll never understand. Mutual terror. What was it so scared of? What did it see when it looked at me? Story 4. It still gets to me, you know, even years later, just thinking about it. It's not something you really shake off, I guess. We were young, dumb, thinking we were invincible, like nothing bad could ever really touch us. Me, Mark, and David, we were always looking for something, an adventure, a thrill, anything to get out of the same old routine. That's how we ended up in Whispering Pines. It sounded perfect on paper, or rather online. Secluded, they called it. Immerse yourself in nature. Oak Haven, Florida. I looked it up. Seemed remote, a bit spooky, even with that name Serpent Swamp nearby. We thought, perfect weekend getaway, let's rough it. Famous last words, right? The drive itself should have been a sign. The closer we got, the darker and heavier the clouds became. By the time we reached the entrance to Whispering Pines campground, it was pouring, like proper Florida downpour, the kind where you can't see 2 feet in front of you. And the swamp trail? Don't even get me started. They said trail, but it was more like a muddy, overgrown ditch winding through the swamp. We were soaked to the bone before we even parked the car. Lugging all our gear through that muck was a nightmare. Everything was heavy, waterlogged, and the rain just kept coming, relentless. The trees were thick, blocking out what little light was left, even though it was only afternoon. It felt like we were walking deeper and deeper into something ancient, something that didn't want us there. The air was thick and humid, and the swamp smelled, I don't know how to describe it, earthy, yes, but also rotten, almost. Like something was decaying nearby, but everywhere. By the time we finally found a clearing that vaguely resembled a campsite, the light was fading fast. We were all exhausted, irritable, and the rain was still hammering down. Trying to get the tents up in the dark, in the mud, with shaky hands and cheap flashlights, was comedy of errors. Batteries were already dying in the flashlights, casting these pathetic yellow circles that barely cut through the gloom. We got one tent up mostly, more of a soggy, leaning mess than anything sturdy. Mark muttered something about a lantern, saying he thought he'd packed one, but couldn't find it in the chaos. David rummaged around and found some half-eaten trail mix that was mostly crumbs and damp granola. Morale was low, real low. Then Mark, in his infinite wisdom, says, "Hey, I saw on the campground website something about a ranger station near the entrance. Maybe they sell lanterns or something? Worth a shot." David, always the practical one, agreed. Anything was better than trying to navigate in the dark with these pathetic flashlight beams. So that's how it happened. Mark and David decided to trek back to the entrance to try and find a lantern. They promised they'd be quick. "Just an hour tops," Mark said, flashing his almost dead flashlight with forced optimism. And then they were gone, just like that. Vanished into the darkness and the rain. I was left alone. At first, it wasn't so bad. I started trying to organize the gear inside the tent, or what was supposed to be inside the tent if it wasn't all spread around soaking wet. I huddled deeper inside, trying to get away from the damp and the growing chill. The forest outside was just loud. Rain pounding on the tent canvas, the constant drip, drip, drip of water falling from the trees, and the wind. It was like the wind was sighing through the pines, making this low, mournful sound that gave me the creeps. Time started to stretch. An hour felt like 2. I kept checking my watch, squinting at the dim face. Where were they? It shouldn't have taken this long. Maybe they'd gotten lost. No, they had flashlights. Mostly dead flashlights, but still. The trail back to the entrance couldn't be that hard to follow, even in the dark. The forest got quieter, strangely quiet. The wind died down. The rain seemed to soften to a drizzle. The constant drumming on the tent faded, leaving this eerie hush in its place, and that's when I started to feel it, this pressure, this heavy feeling in the air, like something was watching me. I told myself it was just nerves, just being alone in the dark, in the middle of nowhere. But the feeling wouldn't go away. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump. I strained my ears, listening for any sound of their return, for voices, for the beam of a flashlight cutting through the trees. Nothing, just silence. A thick, heavy silence that seemed to press down on me. Then I smelled it. It was faint at first, almost like a whiff of something rotten, quickly gone. I thought maybe it was just the swamp, the smell of decaying leaves and stagnant water intensified by the damp. But it came again, stronger this time, and it wasn't just earthy. It was foul, like something dead, really, truly dead, and something else. Acrid, chemical almost. It made my stomach churn. That's when I heard the first splash. It wasn't from the rain. It was louder, heavier, like something big had just stepped into water. Then another, and branches started snapping, definitely not the sound of people walking on a trail. This was something moving through the undergrowth, crashing through branches, not bothering to be quiet. My heart started hammering in my chest. Mistake. Maybe it was just deer, or raccoons. Raccoons couldn't make that much noise, could they? And that smell. Deer don't smell like that. The sounds were getting closer, coming from the direction of the swamp, the darker, deeper part of the woods behind our campsite. Louder splashes now, and heavier snapping. It was moving fast, too fast for any normal animal I could think of. A ridiculous idea popped into my head. Prank. Maybe it was Mark and David playing a joke. They were probably back, having a laugh at my expense, sneaking through the swamp to scare me. Okay, yeah, that had to be it. They knew I was jumpy, they knew I'd be on edge being alone. Clever bastards. I actually felt a surge of annoyance. Pranking me in this situation? Not funny, guys, really not funny. But okay, fine. I'd play along. I'd pretend to be scared and then jump out and yell boo when they least expected it. Yeah, that would teach them. I found the stupidest thing I could think of for a prank in return. The can of bug spray. Perfect. I grabbed it, clicked off the safety cap and held it ready, pointed towards the tent flap, waiting. Grit my teeth, Stephen. Don't let them see you're actually freaking out. It's just Mark and David being idiots. The noises were right outside the campsite now. Splashes, snapping, something heavy dragging through the leaves. The smell was overwhelming, like rotten meat mixed with something burning and wet dog, but 1,000 times worse. It was thick in the air, making my eyes water. Then the tent shook. Violently, not from the wind. Something hit the tree right next to the tent. Thump. A massive, solid thump that vibrated through the ground and right up into my bones. The whole tent frame rattled. Whatever it was big, really big. And then came the scream. Oh God, the scream. I will never forget that sound as long as I live. It wasn't human, not even close. It started as a low growl, deep and guttural, like something massive clearing its throat. Then it rose, rapidly, impossibly high, into this piercing, shrieking wail that ripped through the silence. It was pain and rage and something else, something primal, something that sounded ancient and utterly terrifying. It wasn't a scream like a person in danger. It was like the sound of the forest itself screaming. My blood went cold, ice water in my veins. Prank. Bullshit. This was no prank. This was something else entirely. Something monstrous. My mind went blank. Terror, pure and raw, took over. I dropped the bug spray can. I stumbled backwards in the tent, tripping over my own feet, scrambling to get away from the tent flap, away from the sound, away from whatever was outside. Crash. Another impact. Closer this time. Right next to the tent. The canvas billowed inwards, pressing against my face. The tent poles groaned and creaked. I could feel the vibrations through the ground, feel the sheer force of whatever was hitting the tree. It felt like the whole campsite was being shaken apart. I was trapped in this flimsy nylon shelter with that outside. Paralyzed by fear, I just huddled in the back of the tent, knees drawn up to my chest, hands clamped over my ears, trying to block out the screams, the crashes, the smell, but it was everywhere, inside me. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Silence. Not the heavy, expectant silence from before. This was empty silence, like something had just sucked all the sound out of the forest. The screaming stopped. The crashing stopped. Even the dripping from the trees seemed to hold its breath. For a few seconds, maybe a minute, everything was still, silent, except for my own ragged breathing and the frantic pounding of my heart. I stayed huddled there, frozen, afraid to even move, afraid to breathe too loud. Then slowly, cautiously, I dared to peek out. Just a tiny crack in the tent flap. Darkness. Deep, impenetrable darkness outside. I could still smell it, that awful stench, but it seemed to be fading slightly. Was it gone? Was it really gone? Or was it just waiting, lurking in the shadows, watching me, waiting for me to make a move? I couldn't stay in the tent. I knew that. Being trapped in there, waiting for it to come back, was worse than anything. I had to get out. I had to run. But run where? Run to where? I had no idea which way was the trail, which way was back to the car, back to anything safe. But I couldn't stay. I couldn't breathe. I scrambled to my feet, knocking over everything in the tent. My flashlight, still barely flickering, had rolled under my sleeping bag. I grabbed it, ignoring the weak beam, and ripped open the tent flap. And I ran. I didn't think, didn't plan, didn't look back. I just ran, straight into the forest, through the trees, tripping over roots, stumbling in the mud, pushing through branches that clawed at my face and clothes. I just ran blindly, desperately, away from the campsite, away from the smell, away from the screams. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like forever. My lungs burned, my legs ached, my chest heaved. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The fear was driving me, pushing me onward. I just wanted to get away, to get as far away from that place as possible. Finally, I collapsed. I fell to my knees, gasping for air, leaning against a tree, too exhausted to run another step. I was lost, disoriented, alone and terrified. But I was away from the tent. I was away from it. As my breathing started to even out, I realized something. Faint light. Ahead of me, through the trees. Not much, just a glimmer, but it was light. Hope flared within me, a tiny spark in the overwhelming darkness. Could it be? I staggered to my feet and started walking towards the light. Slowly at first, then faster as the light grew brighter. And then I saw them. Figures moving in the dim light, flashlights bobbing, voices, faint, muffled voices, but voices nonetheless. Mark? David? My voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. Stephen? Is that you? Stephen? It was David's voice. Relief washed over me in a wave so strong it almost buckled my knees again. They were okay. They were back. And I wasn't alone anymore. They rushed towards me, their flashlight beams finally picking me out in the darkness. "Stephen! What the hell happened? We've been calling for you." Mark sounded annoyed. They were clueless. You guys were gone forever. Something happened at the campsite." I was babbling, still shaking, trying to catch my breath. "Gone forever?" "We were gone like an hour, maybe 2 tops. We found a lantern at the ranger station, see? What's wrong with you?" David held up a battery-powered lantern, its bright beam cutting through the darkness. No, you don't understand." I started to tell them about the sounds, the smell, the scream, the tree shaking, everything. They looked at me like I was crazy. A scream? Tree shaking? "Stephen, you were probably just freaked out being alone in the dark. It's just the woods, man. Animals." Mark was dismissive. "No, it wasn't animals. It was different. You don't understand." I tried to explain again, the terror still fresh in my mind, but they just kept shaking their heads, rolling their eyes. "Let's just get back to the campsite," David said finally. "We can sort this out there. You're probably just imagining things. Too much swamp trail mix." He chuckled weakly, trying to lighten the mood, but I wasn't laughing. We walked back to the campsite. The lantern illuminated the clearing, chasing away the immediate darkness. Everything looked normal. Well, as normal as a rain-soaked, mud-filled campsite could look. The tent was still standing, if a bit crumpled, no sign of anything unusual. "See? Nothing here," Mark said, gesturing around with the lantern. "Told you, just your imagination running wild." But I wasn't imagining it. I knew what I'd heard, what I'd smelled, what I'd felt. And then I pointed to the tree. "That one," I said, my voice still trembling. "The one next to the tent. Something hit it, hard, really hard. It shook the whole tent." They looked at the tree, a big pine, solid and tall. Nothing obviously wrong with it in the lantern light. Mark shrugged. "Probably just a branch fell. Wind was pretty strong earlier." "No, it wasn't a branch. It was like something big, something heavy slammed into it." I insisted, frustration building inside me. Didn't they believe me? David walked over to the tree and put his hand on the trunk. "Feels like a tree to me," he said, still skeptical. "Try to shake it," I challenged him. "Try to shake it like something slammed into it." Mark and David exchanged glances, still clearly thinking I was being dramatic. But they humored me. They both grabbed onto the tree trunk, pushing and shoving, trying to shake it. They were strong guys, but the tree didn't budge, not even a little, solid as a rock. They tried again, straining, grunting, putting their full weight into it. Nothing. The tree remained unmoving. They stopped, breathing heavily, and looked at each other, then back at me. The skepticism in their eyes had faded, replaced by something else. Doubt, uncertainty, a flicker of fear. "Okay," David said slowly, his voice quieter now. "Okay, maybe something did hit it. Pretty damn hard, if it felt like it shook the tent." He rubbed his arm, as if still feeling the phantom vibration. Mark was staring at the tree, his face pale in the lantern light. "And that scream you heard, you're sure it wasn't just an animal? Like a fox or something?" "Foxes don't scream like that," I said, my voice low and steady now. "Trust me, it wasn't an animal I've ever heard before. It wasn't human. It was something else." The silence stretched between us, heavy and thick with unspoken fear. The lantern light seemed to shrink in the surrounding darkness, making the shadows around the campsite deeper and more menacing. "Okay," Mark said finally, breaking the silence. "Okay, I believe you. Something happened here, something weird." He shivered despite himself. We didn't say much more after that. We huddled around the lantern, the three of us pressed close together, staring out into the darkness, listening to every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig. We didn't sleep. Not a wink. Every noise was amplified in the silence. Every shadow seemed to move. The smell was still faintly there, a lingering reminder of whatever had been out there. As soon as dawn started to break, painting the sky a pale, watery grey, we packed up. Silently, efficiently, without a word. We just wanted to get out of Whispering Pines, out of Serpent Swamp, out of that cursed forest. We didn't talk about it much afterwards, not really. We kind of just agreed to forget it ever happened, or at least try to. Mark and David, they probably still think I imagined most of it, that I was just spooked by being alone. But I know what I heard. I know what I smelled. I know what I felt when that tree shook, and I still can't explain it. To this day. What was it? What was out there in the Serpent Swamp that night? I don't know, and honestly I don't think I ever want to find out. Some things are better left unknown, hidden in the dark depths of places like Whispering Pines. We got out alive, and that's all that matters, right? But sometimes, late at night when everything is quiet, I still hear that scream in my head. And I still smell that smell, and I still get the chills, remembering that feeling of utter primal terror. And I know deep down that whatever it was real, and it was out there. Story 5. Okay, so this is really hard to write about even now. It still gets to me. I haven't really told many people, not properly. You know how it is. Folks look at you sideways if you talk about stuff like this. But seeing some of the stories here makes me think maybe someone might actually understand, or at least believe me. It was supposed to be a normal family vacation. My dad, John, my mom, Mary, and me, Emily. I was 14 then, almost 15. We were going camping. We always tried to do something outdoorsy during the summer, and this year Dad found this place, Redwood Creek Resort. Sounded perfect online. Cabins, camping spots, trails, near this shadowwood forest in Florida. We're from around Orlando, so not a crazy drive, just a few hours out to Gilwood County. The drive was fine, normal road trip stuff, arguing over music, Mom reading the park brochure out loud. Redwood Creek itself looked okay when we got there. It wasn't fancy, more like basic. A check-in shack, a small store with junk food and bug spray, a field for RVs, and then these scattered campsites in the woods. We chose a tent site because Dad always said it was more authentic. Our site was decent enough, spaced out from the others. We set up the tent, unpacked, got the fire pit going. The afternoon was actually pretty nice. We hiked a short trail down to the creek, skipped rocks. Mum took pictures of wildflowers. Dad was in his element, chopping wood, talking about roughing it, even though we had an air mattress and a cooler full of ice. It felt normal, like just another camping trip. Even Shadowwood Forest, which was right on the edge of the resort property, didn't seem that scary then. Just woods. Trees are trees, right? Night fell, we cooked hot dogs over the fire, made s'mores, told lame jokes. It was peaceful. Fire crackling, crickets chirping, all that usual nature background noise. We went to bed maybe around 10. The air got cooler, which was nice for sleeping in a tent in Florida in July. The first night really was uneventful. I slept pretty well, actually. Woke up to birds singing and the sun just starting to peek through the trees. Mom was already making coffee on the little camp stove. It felt good. Like maybe this camping thing wasn't so bad after all. The second day, we went for a longer hike, deeper into the woods around Redwood Creek, but not Shadowwood itself, thank God. We saw some deer, a bunch of squirrels, normal forest stuff. We even found a little waterfall and ate our sandwiches there. It was hot, humid, but in the shade of the trees, it was bearable. Still, there was something, I don't know, different about the woods there. Kind of quieter than usual, maybe? Like the usual forest sounds were a little muffled. Or maybe it was just my imagination. That second night, though, that's when things started feeling off. We were all tired from the hike, so we went to bed a little earlier, maybe 9:30. It was dark, like really dark outside the tent. No moon that night, I think, just the faint glow of the fire dying down. I was almost asleep when I heard it. Just a rustle at first, like an animal in the leaves, you know? Squirrel or raccoon, whatever. I didn't think much of it. But then it came again, closer this time, louder, more like something bigger pushing through the bushes right outside our tent. It wasn't just a little rustling anymore. It was definitely something. I nudged Mom, whispered, "Did you hear that?" She was half asleep, mumbled, "Probably just a raccoon, honey. Go back to sleep." But I couldn't. The sounds kept coming. Rustling, snapping twigs, like something was circling our tent. Sometimes it would stop and then start again from a different direction. It wasn't like random animal noises. It felt deliberate, like something was out there, moving around us, checking us out. I got really jumpy. Every little snap or rustle made me flinch. I could hear Dad snoring softly in his sleeping bag, totally oblivious. Mom had probably drifted back to sleep too. I was the only one awake, just lying there in the dark, listening to these sounds outside our tent. My heart started beating faster, and then there was a sound that wasn't rustling. It was heavier, like something large stepping on the forest floor. A heavy thud, not like deer hooves, deeper, heavier, more solid. And then another one, closer. Thud, thud. My breath caught in my throat. I squeezed my eyes shut, tried to tell myself it was nothing, just my imagination, the woods being noisy at night. But the thuds kept coming, slow and deliberate, circling our tent. Then there was a different sound mixed in with the thuds and rustles. A kind of sniffle. A wet, snorting sniffle. Like an animal sniffing the air. A big animal. It was right outside the tent wall now. So close. I could practically feel it out there. I was terrified, completely frozen. I wanted to scream, to wake up Mom and Dad, but my voice wouldn't come out. I just lay there, paralyzed, listening to these heavy footsteps and wet sniffs right outside our thin nylon tent. It felt like forever, but it was probably only a few minutes. Then, slowly, the sounds started to fade. The thuds moved further away, the rustling quieted down, the sniffling disappeared. Silence again, except for the crickets. I lay there for hours, wide awake, staring into the dark tent ceiling, heart still pounding, waiting for sunrise. Every little creak of the trees, every rustle of leaves, made me jump. I didn't sleep a wink the rest of the night. When morning finally came, I felt exhausted and wired at the same time. Mom and Dad were up, making breakfast like nothing had happened. Dad was even whistling. I looked at him, at Mom, and wondered how they could be so normal. Didn't they hear anything last night? "You okay, Em?" Mom asked, noticing I was quiet. "You look tired." I hesitated. I didn't want to sound crazy, but I needed to say something. I didn't sleep well," I said, voice shaky. "I heard noises last night outside the tent." Dad chuckled. "Oh, probably just some raccoons getting into our trash. We should have hung the food bag higher." "It wasn't raccoons," I said, louder this time. "It was bigger, heavier, and it was circling the tent, and I heard sniffing." Mom looked at me with concern. "Sniffing? Like what, honey?" I didn't want to say it. It sounded ridiculous even to me, but I had to tell someone. Like an animal, a big animal, sniffing, at the tent. It felt really close. Dad shrugged it off. "Maybe a deer got curious. They wander around at night sometimes." "It wasn't a deer, Dad," I insisted. "It was heavier. The footsteps were heavy." They looked at each other, then back at me. I could tell they didn't believe me. Or maybe they thought I was exaggerating, scared by normal nighttime forest sounds. But I knew what I heard, and it wasn't normal. We went about our day, tried to act normal, had breakfast, packed up some sandwiches, went for another hike. But I was on edge all day. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig made me jump. I kept looking back over my shoulder, scanning the trees, expecting something, but there was nothing, just trees and sunlight and birds. We hiked deeper into the woods again that day. Not Shadowwood, still around Redwood Creek, but further out. It felt even quieter that day, if that was possible. Less bird song, less squirrel chatter. Like the forest itself was holding its breath. I kept getting this feeling like we were being watched. The afternoon dragged on. The sun started to get lower in the sky. The shadows got longer. We started heading back to camp, and as we got closer to our campsite, the woods started to feel different again. Colder somehow. Darker. Even though the sun was still above the trees, it felt like twilight was already settling in. We got back to our campsite maybe around 6:30. The air was cooler now, the shadows long and deep. Dad started getting the fire going again. Mom was getting dinner ready, foil packet meals you just toss on the coals. I just sat on a log staring into the woods, still feeling jumpy, still feeling watched. Twilight. That's when it happened. Dinner was almost ready. Dad was fussing with the fire, Mum was getting the foil packets ready, and I just needed to pee. The campsite bathrooms were a little walk away, down a path through the trees. Annoying, but whatever. I grabbed the roll of toilet paper and told Mom I was going to the bathroom. "Don't wander off," she said without looking up from the foil packets. "And take the flashlight." I grabbed the little flashlight from the tent, clicked it on, and headed down the path. It was getting darker now, the shadows really deep. The beam of the flashlight cut a weak path through the gloom. The woods around the path felt thick and close, closer than before. The quiet was intense, eerie quiet. Not even crickets chirping anymore. I walked maybe 50 feet down the path, stopped near a clump of bushes, did my business, and turned around to head back. And that's when I saw them. Eyes, glowing green, reflecting in the dim light from the campsite fire, from the edge of the bushes, just beyond the path. Green, glowing eyes staring right at me. My blood ran cold. I froze, stared back at those eyes, and they stared back at me. Unblinking, intense green glow, like cat's eyes, but bigger, much bigger. Then slowly, something started to move in the bushes. Rustling, snapping branches, just like the night before. But this time, I wasn't in the tent. I was outside, alone. And then it stepped out of the bushes, into a small clearing, maybe 60 feet away, out of the shadows, into the dim twilight, and I saw it, oh God, I saw it. It was huge, taller than a person at least, maybe 7, 8 feet tall, upright, like a man, but not, covered in dark fur, thick, matted dark fur all over its body, ape-like maybe, but wrong, so wrong, and its face, Jesus Christ, its face, it was human-like. In a way, 2 eyes, nose, mouth, roughly in the right places, but monstrous, distorted, brutish. The brow was heavy, sloping, the nose was flat and wide. The mouth was wide too, with fangs, long yellowed fangs, sticking out past its lips. And those eyes, those green glowing eyes, so intense, so cold, so intelligent. But not human intelligence, something else, something ancient and wild and terrifying. It stood there just looking at me, motionless, towering, bathed in the flickering firelight and the deepening twilight. The green eyes burning into me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't even scream, just stood there, frozen solid, staring at this thing, this creature, this ape man. It took a slow step forward, then another, moving slowly, deliberately towards me, still staring, those eyes. The smell hit me then, overpowering, foul, like rotting meat, like decay, death, an absolutely disgusting, nauseating stench. It filled the air, heavy and thick, making me gag. That smell, I'll never forget that smell. It was like pure evil, concentrated and made tangible. It took another step, closer now, maybe 50 feet, and then it stopped. just stood there, still staring, that foul smell washing over me. I could see it clearly now, in the fading light and the firelight. The thick, dark fur, the massive chest and shoulders, the long arms hanging down almost to its knees, the monstrous, human-like face with those burning green eyes. And then, slowly, unbelievably slowly, it started to turn away from me, back towards the woods, back into the shadows. Still facing me for a moment, those eyes still locked on mine. Then, inch by agonizing inch, it turned its massive body, back to the dense bushes. It took one slow step, then another, and then it was gone, melted back into the foliage, vanished, leaving only the lingering, overpowering stench of decay and something else. Something wrong. Something deeply, profoundly wrong. I stood there shaking for what felt like forever. Then finally my legs started working again. I turned, stumbled, ran back down the path, flashlight dropped somewhere in the dirt, ran blindly, desperately, back towards the campsite. I burst into the campsite, gasping for breath, eyes wide, pointing back towards the woods. It's there, I saw it. Mum and Dad stared at me, shocked. Emily, what is it? What happened? The ape man, I choked out. The Shadowwood ape man. It was there, in the woods. I saw it. Those eyes, the smell. I couldn't even finish the sentence. I just stood there, shaking and sobbing, pointing back towards the dark woods, the smell still clinging to the air, even at the campsite. Mom and Dad were stunned. They looked at each other, then at me, then back at the woods. They could smell it too now, that awful, putrid smell. It had drifted over to the campsite, heavy and sickening. Dad, finally, slowly, stood up. He looked pale. What did you see, Emily? Tell me exactly. I tried to describe it. The height, the fur, the face, the eyes, the smell, everything. My voice was shaking so badly I could barely speak. But I told them everything I saw. They listened. They listened to every word, their faces growing paler and paler. The smell was getting stronger now, pervading everything. When I finished, there was silence, except for the crackling fire and my ragged breathing, and the heavy, oppressive smell of decay. Finally, Dad spoke, his voice low and quiet. The Shadowwood ape man, he whispered. People have told stories. Mom nodded slowly, her eyes wide and scared. I read something about it online before we came, local legend, but I didn't think. Dad looked at me, his eyes serious, completely different from how he'd been earlier. Emily, he said, do you swear to me you saw what you described? I nodded, tears streaming down my face. Yes, I swear, I saw it. It was real. He looked at Mom. Mom looked back at him. No one said anything for a long moment. Then Dad made a decision. A quick, sharp decision. We're leaving, he said, his voice firm now. Now, we pack up everything. Right now, we're getting out of here. Mom didn't argue, she just nodded, her face white. Yes, she said. Yes, let's go. We moved fast, faster than I ever thought we could. Terror is a hell of a motivator. We didn't even bother putting out the fire properly, just kicked dirt on it until the flames died down. We ripped the tent stakes out of the ground, threw everything into the car, haphazardly, not even folding things, just stuffing everything in. Clothes, sleeping bags, food, everything. We didn't talk. We just worked, frantically, silently, driven by a primal fear. Within maybe 15 minutes we were packed. Everything was crammed into the car, the tent and sleeping bags sticking out the back. Dad started the engine. He put the car in drive, and we drove. We drove out of that campsite, out of Redwood Creek Resort, away from Shadowwood Forest, without looking back. We didn't stop driving until we were hours away. We drove all through the night. Didn't talk much. Just drove, and drove, away from that place. We didn't go home right away. We checked into a motel in some random town. Just wanted to be inside, walls around us, away from the woods, away from the dark. away from that smell. We stayed in that motel for 2 days, barely slept, barely talked, just existed. The smell lingered in my mind, in my nose, even in the motel room. I could still see those green eyes in my dreams. We went home eventually, unpacked the car, washed the camping gear, tried to get back to normal. But nothing was ever really normal after that, not for me at least. I still see those eyes sometimes, when I close my eyes in the dark. I still smell that awful stench in my nightmares. I know what I saw that night. I know it was real, the Shadowwood apeman. Whatever it was real. And I'll never go camping again, not ever, not near any woods, not anywhere. Just thinking about it makes my skin crawl. And the worst part? The part that really messes with my head? We left so fast, in such a panic, I never got to see if anyone else at the resort saw it too, if anyone else experienced that, if we were the only ones, or if that thing was out there stalking other campers that same night, and if it still is, out there in Shadowwood Forest, watching, waiting, and smelling of death. I just don't know, and I never want to know. Story 6. It was supposed to be a break, you know, a real escape. Me and Tom, we'd been working our butts off for months, both drowning in deadlines and stress. We desperately needed to disconnect, breathe some fresh air, and just be together. Tom, bless his heart, is the planner in our relationship. He researches everything meticulously, reads reviews for hours, and always finds these unique spots. This time, it was Blackwater Springs Park, Florida. He'd found this campsite, supposedly secluded, in a swampy area near something called Whispering Willows. Sounded atmospheric, right? Romantic, even. We packed the car, drove for hours, and finally arrived at the park in the late afternoon. The air was thick and humid, buzzing with insects I didn't even recognize. It smelled earthy, like wet dirt and decaying leaves, but also kind of sweet, in a strange, heavy way. The campsite itself was further in than I expected. We had to hike in about half a mile, deeper into the woods than the other sites seemed to be. Tom was all excited about the seclusion, pointing out how private it was, surrounded by these tall, spindly trees, draped with moss that looked like ghostly beards. Honestly, even then, in the fading sunlight, it felt a little eerie. Setting up the tent was sticky and hot. Mosquitoes were already having a field day with me, even with bug spray. We were both a little quieter than usual, I think. That heavy air, the dense woods, it just kind of sucked the energy out of you. We cooked some simple pasta on a portable stove as the last light bled out of the sky. The sounds of the swamp really started to come alive then. Crickets, frogs, the rustling of things in the underbrush. It was loud, but in a natural way. We were used to nature sounds, both being from rural areas originally. It should have been calming even. But as true darkness descended, things changed. The swamp noises got louder, more intense. It wasn't just crickets and frogs anymore. There were other sounds now, deeper, rustling sounds, like something bigger moving around out there. We had a small campfire going, and the flames flickered, throwing dancing shadows all around us. Tom put another log on, and for a minute, the crackle of the fire was all we could hear. He was trying to be cheerful, telling me about how great it was to be away from our phones and laptops, but I could tell he was feeling it too. That something in the air. We decided to go to bed early, figuring we could hike around the trails in the morning when it was cooler. I crawled into my sleeping bag, still feeling a bit clammy and unsettled. Tom turned off the lantern, and the darkness instantly became thick, black, almost solid. The fire was dying down, just glowing embers now. Outside the tent, the swamp noises continued, maybe even louder than before. I remember lying there, listening, trying to pick out the familiar sounds from the unfamiliar ones. Then it started. It began subtly. A faint sound carried on the night air, almost lost in the general swamp orchestra. but it was different, higher pitched, more strained. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a bird in distress. But then it grew louder, and clearer, and colder. It was a scream, not like a human scream, not exactly, but something close, high-pitched, piercing, and full of agony. It ripped through the night, cutting through all the other swamp noises, making everything else seem insignificant. My heart instantly jumped into my throat. I squeezed Tom's arm in the darkness. He was awake too. I could feel him tense up beside me. The scream faded, but it didn't stop. It came again, and again, incessant, relentless. Each scream was more chilling than the last. They weren't animal cries I recognized. I grew up in the countryside. I know animal sounds. This was something else, something unnatural. It sounded like pain, raw, agonizing pain, but mixed with something else, something inhuman. Fear, real, bone-chilling fear clamped down on me. I was paralyzed. My breath hitched in my chest, and I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs. I wanted to say something to Tom, but my throat was too tight. I just clung to his arm, listening, terrified. The screams seemed to come from all around us, from the swamp that encircled our campsite. It was impossible to pinpoint a direction. They echoed through the trees, bouncing off the water, seeming to come closer and closer with each cry. It wasn't just loud, it was oppressive. Like the sound itself was pressing down on us, crushing us with dread. And the quality of the screams, that's what really got to me. It wasn't just the sound of pain, there was something else woven into it. A layer of something alien, like it was being made by a creature that shouldn't exist. Like something ripped from a nightmare and thrown into the real world. Tom whispered, his voice tight and strained. What is that?" I shook my head, unable to speak. I had no idea. And the not knowing made it even worse. If it had been an animal, even a dangerous one, there would be a reference point, something to understand, to rationalize. But this defied any explanation. We lay there, frozen, listening to the screams tear through the night, one after another, without pause. They went on and on. It felt like hours. Time stretched and warped, each scream an eternity of terror. The air inside the tent seemed to get colder, despite the humid night. My skin prickled, and I felt a constant wave of goosebumps wash over me. I remember thinking, very clearly, very calmly amidst the rising panic, we are not going to survive this night. It wasn't a dramatic thought or some movie line, it was just a statement of fact, a cold, hard realization that settled deep in my bones. The screams were too relentless, too close, too wrong. Whatever was making those sounds, it felt like it was closing in. Hunting. Tom tried to move, to sit up maybe, but he froze again like he'd thought better of it. I knew what he was thinking. Running was pointless. Where would we go? It was pitch black outside. The screams were everywhere. Moving would just make us visible, vulnerable. Staying put inside the flimsy tent felt like the only sliver of protection we had, however pathetic it was. We stayed silent, huddled together, listening to the screams. They seemed to change sometimes higher, sometimes lower, sometimes closer, sometimes further away, but always constant, always terrifying. There were moments when the screams were so close, it felt like they were right outside the tent flap. I'd flinch, expecting something to tear through the fabric. To what? I didn't even want to imagine. My mind started racing, jumping to irrational places. Monsters, demons, something from folklore. Whispering Willows screamer. The name Whispering Willows suddenly took on a whole new, sinister meaning. What were Whispering Willows? Why was it called that? Was there something known about this place that we hadn't researched, hadn't found in the online reviews? Had we blundered into something ancient, something dangerous, something otherworldly? Rationality kept trying to push back. It's just an animal. A small voice in my head whispered, maybe a mountain lion, or a coyote with a really bad cough. But the screams, they were too complex, too articulated. They weren't the simple cries of a wild animal. They sounded sentient, aware, and full of unimaginable pain and rage. The night dragged on. Each minute felt like an hour. The screams continued without any sign of stopping. Sleep was impossible. Even closing my eyes was too much. The darkness inside the tent, combined with the screams outside, felt suffocating. I kept my eyes wide open, staring into the blackness, listening, waiting, dreading. At some point, exhaustion started to creep in, but fear kept it at bay. My body was strung tight, every muscle tense. I was shaking, trembling almost uncontrollably, but somehow I couldn't even feel the cold anymore. Fear had burned it away, replaced it with a white-hot terror that consumed everything. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, the faintest hint of light began to appear in the east. Dawn. It felt like a lifetime away when darkness had fallen, and now, after this endless night of horror, light was actually coming back. Hope, fragile and hesitant, flickered inside me. As the first weak rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, the screams faded. Just gradually, they became less frequent, less intense, until finally they stopped altogether. Silence descended on the swamp, a profound, absolute silence that was almost as unsettling as the screams had been. We lay there, still huddled together, listening to the silence. For a long time, neither of us moved. We were afraid to. Afraid that the silence was just a trick, a lull before the storm. Afraid that if we moved, if we made any noise, the screams would start again. But the silence held. The birds began to chirp, tentatively at first, then with more confidence. The normal morning sounds of the woods started to return, slowly pushing back the residue of the night's terror. Finally, after what felt like another eternity, Tom moved. He sat up slowly, cautiously, and looked at me. His face was pale, drawn, with dark circles under his eyes. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. And I'm sure I looked just as bad. He whispered, Are they gone? I shook my head again. I don't know. But the silence felt different now. It felt normal, relatively. After the unearthly torment of the screams, normal was a huge relief. Slowly, cautiously, we unzipped the tent and peeked outside. Sunlight streamed through the trees, casting long shadows on the ground. The campsite was untouched, just as we'd left it. No signs of struggle, no footprints other than our own, nothing disturbed. It was like the night of terror had been some kind of hallucination, some collective nightmare. Except we both heard it. We got out of the tent, stiff and sore, moving like robots. The air felt different in the daylight, less heavy, almost clean. We packed up our things quickly, mechanically, not speaking. We just wanted to get out of there, out of the swamp, out of whispering willows. As we were finishing up, we heard voices approaching. Other campers. They'd heard our commotion the night before, they said. They'd been kept up all night by the screams, too. They were just as shaken as we were. One of them, an older guy with a grizzled beard, said, Whispering Willows Screamer, they call it. Screamer, like it was a known thing, a local legend. He told us that people sometimes heard those screams in this part of the park, especially near Whispering Willows. No one knew what it was exactly. Some said it was a rare bird, some said it was an animal they couldn't identify. Some whispered darker things. Old legends, swamp spirits, things you don't want to think about when you're miles from civilization in the middle of the night. We didn't stick around to hear more stories. We just packed the last of our gear, thanked them numbly for checking in, and hiked out of there as fast as we could. We didn't talk much in the car on the way home either. What could we say? How do you explain something like that? We made it home, took long showers, and just sat in silence for a while. trying to process what had happened, trying to convince ourselves it wasn't just some crazy dream. Even now, months later, I can still hear those screams in my head sometimes, especially when it's dark and quiet. That night in the swamp, it changed something in me. I used to love camping, being out in nature. Now I hesitate. Now when I hear nighttime sounds outside my window, I listen a little too closely. I scan the darkness a little too intently. I still don't know what we heard that night. Whispering Willow's Screamer sounds like a made-up name, a silly local myth to scare tourists. But the screams, those were real. I know what I heard. Tom knows what he heard. And whatever it was, out there in the darkness of the swamp, I never, ever want to hear it again. It wasn't just scary. It was something beyond scary. Something that burrowed deep into your soul and left a cold, empty space behind. And the worst part? We got away unscathed. We survived. But sometimes, lying awake at night, I wonder if a part of us is still back there, in that swamp, listening to those screams, trapped in that endless, terrifying night. Story 7. We packed everything we thought we'd need. Way too much stuff, probably. But we were newbies. Tent, sleeping bags, cooking stuff, lanterns, the works. We drove for hours, getting further and further from civilization. The roads got smaller, turned to dirt, then gravel. When we finally pulled up to the spot we'd vaguely marked on a map, it was different. The air was thick, heavy with humidity, even though it was late afternoon. The trees were tall, ancient-looking, draped in Spanish moss that seemed to move even when there was no breeze. There was a silence, but not a peaceful silence, more like a holding-your-breath kind of quiet. We found a clearing near what I guessed were the mounds, just subtle rises in the ground, overgrown with grass and trees. But you could tell they weren't natural. Serpent Creek was close by, a murky, slow-moving ribbon of water. It looked black in the shade of the trees. Honestly, it was a bit creepy even in the daylight, but that was part of the appeal, right? Adventure. Setting up the tent took longer than we thought. We kept bickering about the instructions, but eventually we got it done. By then, the sun was starting to dip below the trees. We made a fire, cooked some basic food, and just sat there, watching the flames dance, listening to the sounds of the forest as night fell. Crickets, frogs, the rustle of leaves. It was peaceful in a way, or at least it was supposed to be. As it got darker, the sounds changed. The crickets got louder, almost frantic. And there were other noises, snapping twigs, rustling in the undergrowth, things moving just out of sight. It's the woods at night, I told myself. Animals. But Sarah got quiet. I could see her looking around, her eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" she whispered after a while. "Hear what? Just the woods, babe." I tried to sound casual, but I'd heard it too. Something heavier moving in the trees, not just squirrels or birds, something bigger. We stoked the fire a bit higher, trying to push back the darkness. We talked, mostly about dumb stuff, trying to ignore the growing unease. We even laughed a few times, but the sounds kept coming, closer it seemed, more insistent. Finally, exhaustion won. We put the fire down, made sure it was safe, and crawled into the tent. It felt thin, flimsy all of a sudden, like a plastic bag against the vast, dark woods. We lay there in our sleeping bags, listening. The sounds of the night pressed in on us, amplified by the silence inside the tent. And then it started. It was a noise that woke me instantly, tearing me from sleep. A crashing, thrashing sound just outside the tent, like something huge was stumbling, falling, breaking branches. Sarah gasped beside me, jolting awake. "What was that?" she whispered, her voice tight with fear. I sat up, heart hammering against my ribs. "I don't know. An animal? Maybe a deer?" I tried to convince myself, but the sound had been too violent, too heavy. The crashing stopped. Silence. Then a different sound, a heavy, rhythmic thudding, like footsteps, big footsteps. coming closer. My breath hitched in my throat. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I switched it on, the beam of light cutting weakly through the fabric of the tent. "Don't," Sarah whispered, grabbing my arm. "Don't look." "We have to," I said, my voice barely a croak. "We need to know what it is." The thudding was right outside the tent now. I could feel the ground vibrating slightly. Something was close, incredibly close. Slowly, I reached for the zipper of the tent. My hand was numb with cold sweat despite the humid air. Each zip of the fabric seemed deafening in the silence. Sarah was pressed against me, trembling. I pulled the zipper open just a crack, just enough to peek out. The moonlight was surprisingly bright, casting stark shadows through the trees. And there, just a few feet from the tent, was it. It was huge, taller than a man, maybe 7 or 8 feet. Covered in thick, matted hair, dark reddish-brown in the moonlight. It was hunched over, its back to us, but I could see the immense width of its shoulders, the powerful muscles in its arms. It was ape-like, but bigger, more monstrous. Its arms were long, reaching almost to the ground, and the way it moved, even hunched like that, was unsettlingly fluid, powerful. I felt my blood run cold. Terror, pure and raw, flooded through me. This wasn't an animal I recognized. This wasn't anything I understood. It was messing with something on the ground. At first, I couldn't see what it was. Then it shifted slightly, and I saw a deer carcass, or what was left of it. It was ripped apart, bones jutting out at unnatural angles, flesh torn and scattered, and this thing was tearing into it, ripping chunks of meat with its bare hands, shoving them into its mouth. I could hear the wet tearing sounds, the crunching of bones. I wanted to scream, I wanted to run, but I was frozen, paralyzed by fear. Sarah was whimpering softly beside me, her nails digging into my arm. The creature kept eating, oblivious to us, lost in its gruesome meal. Its movements were savage, primal. It was like something out of a nightmare, something prehistoric, something that shouldn't exist. I watched, horrified, as it devoured the deer. The smell, even through the tent fabric, was sickeningly sweet, metallic. I could feel bile rising in my throat. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only minutes, it finished. It dropped the mangled remains of the deer and straightened up, finally turning its head. And that's when it saw us. Or at least, I think it did. It turned its head towards the tent. Its eyes, I could only glimpse them for a second in the shadows of its brow ridge, but they were dark, intense, predatory, like burning coals in the darkness. It tilted its head, as if listening, sniffing the air. And then it started to move. Slowly at first, deliberately, towards the tent. The thudding footsteps started again, heavy and measured, coming closer, closer. I could feel the vibrations through the ground, feel them in my chest. It was coming for us. Panic finally broke through the paralysis. I scrambled back from the tent flap, pulling Sarah with me. "We have to get out of here," I gasped, my voice shaking uncontrollably. "We have to run." But run where? Into the dark woods, away from our only shelter? It felt insane, but staying in the tent felt like waiting to be eaten. The creature was right outside the tent now. I could hear its heavy breathing, a low, guttural rasp. I could smell it too, a musky, animalistic odor that made my stomach churn. It started to circle the tent, those heavy footsteps going round and round, sniffing, grunting softly, testing the fabric. I could see the shadow of its huge form moving outside, blotting out the moonlight. Sarah was sobbing silently now, clutching my hand, her body shaking with terror. I wanted to protect her, but I felt utterly helpless. What could we do against something like this? We were trapped. Then it stopped circling. Silence again, but a different kind of silence, a waiting silence, a predatory silence, and then the ripping started. Not the tearing of flesh this time, but fabric, sharp, tearing sounds close to my head. It was clawing at the tent, ripping into the nylon with incredible strength. Panic flared again, white hot. This was it. It was breaking in. There was nowhere to go. I grabbed Sarah, pulling her closer. I didn't know what to do, but I couldn't just sit there and wait. I had to fight, or try to fight, or at least something. I grabbed the only weapon I could think of, the heavy metal lantern we'd used for light. It was pathetic, I knew, against something like that, but it was all I had. The ripping intensified. A long tear appeared in the tent wall, right next to where we were huddled. Then another and another. The fabric shredded easily under its claws. I raised the lantern, my hand trembling so badly I could barely hold it. I was ready to swing, to scream, to do anything. The tent wall ripped open, and I could see it. Closer now, impossibly close, its massive head blocking out the moonlight, filling the opening. I could smell its breath now, hot and foul. I could see its teeth, long yellowed fangs. It reached into the tent, a huge hairy arm snaking in, claws extended, reaching for us. I screamed, a primal scream of terror and desperation, and I swung the lantern with all my might, aiming for its face, its head, anything. The lantern connected with something solid. A dull thud, a grunt of pain or surprise from the creature, and for a split second it recoiled, pulled back. That split second was all we needed. "Run!" I yelled at Sarah, shoving her ahead of me. I didn't wait to see what the creature would do. I didn't think. I just ran. We burst out of the ripped tent, into the darkness, into the woods. I grabbed Sarah's hand and pulled her after me, stumbling blindly through the undergrowth. Branches whipped at our faces, thorns tore at our clothes. We didn't stop, we couldn't stop. Behind us I heard a roar, a terrifying, earth-shattering roar of rage and frustration. It was close, too close. It was coming after us. We ran and ran, tripping, falling, scrambling back up, pushing ourselves onwards. We didn't know where we were going. We just ran away from the roar, away from the monster, away from the tent, away from the clearing. We ran until our lungs burned, until our legs screamed, until we couldn't run anymore. We collapsed on the ground, gasping for air, hidden in the thick undergrowth, listening. Silence, only the sounds of the forest again, crickets, frogs, the rustling of leaves, no roar, no heavy footsteps, just silence. Had we lost it? Had we escaped? I didn't know. I didn't dare to believe it. We stayed there, huddled together, shivering in the cool night air, listening for hours, waiting for the sun to rise, waiting to see if it would come back. Dawn finally broke, painting the sky a pale grey. We were still alive, miraculously, impossibly alive. Slowly, cautiously, we made our way back towards the clearing. Our tent was destroyed, ripped to shreds like paper, our gear scattered, torn, trampled. The fire was long dead, and there, just outside the ruined tent, was the deer carcass, completely stripped bare, just bones. And sticking to a low-hanging branch of a nearby tree, snagged on the bark, were long reddish-brown hairs. We didn't say a word. We just looked at each other, our faces pale, our eyes wide with shock and terror. We knew then, without speaking, that we had seen something real, something terrifying, something impossible. We packed up what little we could salvage, our hands still shaking. We didn't talk about it, not really. We just moved, quickly, efficiently, driven by a silent, shared urgency to get away. We drove for hours, not stopping until we were miles and miles away from Gladesville County, miles and miles away from Serpent Creek. We're home now, safe, back in the city, back under the fluorescent lights, surrounded by the hum of computers and people. It feels surreal, like it was all a nightmare. But the memory of those dark eyes, the sound of that roar, the feel of that terror, it's real, too real. And sometimes, late at night when everything is quiet, I still hear the thudding footsteps in my dreams. And I see those long, reddish-brown hairs clinging to the branch, a chilling reminder of what's out there, lurking in the darkness. Something we can't explain, something we can't forget, something that changed us forever. Story 8. Look, I've never written anything like this online before, ever. Mostly I just read stuff, lurk, you know. But after what happened, I feel like I need to get it out. Maybe someone out there will understand. Maybe someone else has seen something similar, I don't know. All I know is I can't keep it bottled up anymore. It started dumb, plain stupid. Jake and me, we get these urges, I guess you could call them. We live near Gladesville County, out in the sticks. Florida's full of places like that. We hunt legally most of the time, but sometimes the legal stuff just isn't enough, you get what I'm saying? We crave that rush, that little bit of danger, the forbidden fruit. And wild boar hunting at night on private land. That was it for us that time. Whispering Creek. People always say stay away from Whispering Creek after dark. Local legends, you know how it is. But that's part of what drew us in, I gotta admit. The spookier the place, the more of a thrill it is. We'd been planning it for weeks, scouting out the area, figuring out how to get in without being seen. We knew Old Man Hemlock owned the land on both sides of the creek for miles. He was serious about no trespassing, had signs posted everywhere, the whole 9 yards. But we figured night was our cover. And Whispering Creek itself, it was perfect. Thick, dark water, cypress knees sticking out like bony fingers, and the woods on either side so dense you could barely see a foot in front of you in broad daylight, let alone at night. Perfect for sneaking in. Perfect for boar to hide. We loaded up the dogs, Duke and Dixie, in the truck. They were good dogs, best boar hounds you could ask for. Always eager to get going, tails wagging, ready for a chase. We drove down those back roads until we got to the edge of Hemlock's property, parked the truck, tucked away in some bushes like we always do, and got the boat ready. It was a small, flat-bottomed John boat, nothing fancy, but perfect for gliding through the shallow creek water. We figured the creek itself was like a natural highway right into the heart of his land. The air was thick and heavy, even for Florida in July. You could feel the humidity clinging to you like a wet blanket. No moon that night, just the faint glimmer of stars peeking through the canopy of trees. Whispering Creek. Even the name gives me the creeps now. It was quiet, too quiet almost. Just the gentle lapping of the water against the sides of the boat and the rustling of leaves every now and then. Normally, out in the woods at night, there's a constant hum of insects, frogs croaking, owls hooting. But this was different. It felt muted, like everything was holding its breath. We pushed off from the bank, Jake in the front with the electric lantern, me in the back steering with the paddle. The dogs were restless in the boat, whining a little, which was unusual. They usually loved boat rides, especially when it meant hunting. We just told them to hush, figured they were just excited. We motored deeper into the creek, the beam of Jake's lantern cutting through the inky darkness. The cypress trees seemed to close in on us, their reflections in the black water making it feel like we were floating in a void. After maybe half an hour, we were deep inside Hemlock's property. We cut the small outboard motor, letting the boat drift silently. This was it. Boar territory. We started scanning the banks with the lantern, listening for any sounds. That's when we heard it. Rustling in the underbrush on the right bank. Heavy rustling like something big moving around. Boar, Jake whispered, grinning. Sounds like a big one. My heart started pounding. This is what we were here for. We pointed the lantern towards the sound, expecting to see a flash of tusk or a dark shape crashing through the bushes. But the rustling stopped. Dead silence. Even the crickets seemed to have shut up. The dogs started to whine louder, more anxiously now. They were huddled at the back of the boat, their tails tucked between their legs, ears flat against their heads. This was really weird. Duke and Dixie were fearless when it came to boar. They'd chase them through anything, any time. What's with them? Jake muttered, noticing the dog's strange behavior for the first time. "Hey, what's wrong with you guys? Boar's right there. Get 'em!" He tried to encourage them, but they just whimpered and pressed themselves even tighter against the boat. That's when I started feeling uneasy too. It wasn't just the dogs. It was the silence, the way the air felt thick and heavy, and the way the woods seemed to be watching us. But we were stubborn and stupid. We came all this way. We weren't turning back now just because the dogs were acting weird. "Maybe it's just a deer," I said, trying to rationalize it. "Or a raccoon, something like that. Let's check it out." Jake nodded, still aiming the lantern at the spot where we heard the rustling. He started to paddle the boat slowly towards the bank. As we got closer, the silence became almost deafening. You could hear your own heartbeat pounding in your ears. We were maybe 10 feet from the bank now, the beam of the lantern shining into the dense thicket of palmetto and scrub brush. And then we saw it. Not a boar, not a deer, not anything I could have ever imagined. At first, it was just a shape, a dark mass in the shadows, but as the light hit it clearer, it started to take form. It was tall, massive, way bigger than any boar, bigger than any deer, and it was standing upright, on 2 legs. I remember my breath catching in my throat. Jake went completely still, like he was frozen solid. The dogs let out a low, guttural growl, the kind I'd never heard from them before, not a hunting growl, but a terrified primal sound. The light caught its skin. It wasn't fur, not exactly. It was thick, matted and dark, like tangled dreadlocks, covering its whole body. And it was massive. Shoulders like a bull, arms hanging down to its knees, and a head that... I can't even describe it. It was like a nightmare creature, something twisted and wrong. The face was mostly hidden in shadow, but I saw glints, reflections in the light, eyes, burning yellow eyes, staring right at us. It just stood there, motionless, for what felt like an eternity, just watching us, those eyes. They were like pools of molten gold in the darkness, cold, intelligent, and predatory. I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the night air. This wasn't an animal. This was something else, something ancient and evil lurking in the shadows of Whispering Creek. Then it moved, slowly at first, just shifting its weight, and a sound came from it. Not a growl, not a roar, something deeper, like a rumble in the earth, vibrating in your chest. It sent shivers down my spine, a primal fear so intense it paralyzed me. Jake snapped first. "Row! Billy! Row!" he screamed, his voice cracking. He dropped the lantern into the bottom of the boat and scrambled backwards, bumping into me. The light rolled around, flashing wildly across the water and the trees, momentarily blinding us. Panic surged through me. I grabbed the paddle and started digging it into the water, paddling as hard as I could. We were moving, but it felt like we were stuck in molasses. The boat was clumsy, slow, and then it crashed through the underbrush, not running, not crashing like a boar. It was like bulldozing its way through, snapping trees and tearing through palmetto like it was nothing. The sound was deafening, terrifying. It was coming after us. I didn't look back. I just paddled, every muscle in my body screaming, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. Jake was in the front, yelling, urging me to go faster, his eyes wide with terror. The dogs were whimpering, trembling, huddled in the bottom of the boat. The crashing behind us was getting closer, faster. It was moving through the woods like a freight train. Impossible. Nothing that big, that heavy, should be able to move that fast through that dense undergrowth. We rounded a bend in the creek, the boat scraping against the bank, nearly tipping over. I just kept paddling, blindly, desperately, driven by pure, unadulterated terror. The sound of its pursuit was still behind us, relentless, closing in. I could hear branches snapping, trees cracking. It was like the woods themselves were being torn apart. Suddenly, the boat lurched forward, hitting something hard. We were stuck. Cypress knee, probably. Damn it! I pushed harder with the paddle, trying to get us unstuck, but we were wedged tight. Behind us, the crashing was getting closer. I could almost feel it breathing down my neck. Jake screamed again. "It's going to get us! It's going to get us!" He was thrashing around in the front of the boat, grabbing for anything to push us off the cypress knee. In desperation, I threw my weight to one side of the boat, rocking it violently. Finally, with a sickening scraping sound, we came loose. We lurched forward again, spinning around in the water. I wrestled with the paddle, trying to get us back on course, downstream, away from it. We were moving again, but I knew it wasn't enough. It was too close, too fast. I risked a glance back. Through the trees, through the darkness, I saw it. Not clearly, just glimpses. A massive dark shape moving through the woods, keeping pace with us on the bank. It was running, but not like a man runs. It was like gliding almost, effortless, powerful, terrifying. Then I saw its head, just for a second, in a gap in the trees. The lantern in the bottom of the boat was still flickering, casting a weak, erratic light. And in that fleeting light I saw it clearly. The face. It wasn't an animal face. It wasn't human either. It was a grotesque mix of both, like something from a nightmare. Heavy brow ridges, a flattened nose, and teeth, long pointed teeth bared in what I can only describe as a snarl, and those eyes, those burning yellow eyes, locked on us, full of hunger, malice. I screamed. I don't remember what I screamed. Just a raw animal sound of pure terror ripped from my throat. I turned back forward, paddling like a madman. I didn't look back again. I couldn't. We flew down the creek, the little boat bouncing and slapping against the water, throwing spray everywhere. The sounds of pursuit behind us were starting to fade, thankfully. Either we were outrunning it, or maybe it had decided to give up. I didn't care which. I just wanted to get out of Whispering Creek, alive. We didn't stop paddling until we reached the edge of Hemlock's property, until we could see the faint glow of the county road in the distance. We dragged the boat up onto the bank, collapsing onto the muddy ground, gasping for breath, shaking from head to toe. The dogs were still trembling, whining softly. We didn't say anything for a long time. Just sat there in the darkness, listening to our hearts pound, listening to the sounds of the night. Normal sounds now, crickets, frogs, owls. Whispering Creek behind us, silent, empty, or so it seemed. Eventually Jake spoke, his voice hoarse, barely a whisper. What was that?" I shook my head. "I don't know. I have no idea." We packed up the boat, loaded the dogs into the truck, and drove home in silence. The whole way home, I kept seeing those eyes in my mind, those burning yellow eyes, and that face, that monstrous, inhuman face. We haven't spoken about it much since that night. Not really. We try to pretend it didn't happen. We go hunting still sometimes, but never at night. Never near Whispering Creek, ever again. People say Whispering Creek is haunted. Old Indian burial grounds, they say. Strange things happen there. I never believed it before. I do now. I don't know what we saw that night. I don't want to know. All I know is it was real, it was terrifying, and it changed me. I'll never forget those eyes. I'll never forget the sound of it crashing through the woods, hunting us. Sometimes at night, I still hear it. Just the rustling of leaves outside my window, but in my head it sounds like it's still out there, waiting. And I know deep down that whatever it was, it's still out there in Whispering Creek, watching, guardian of the shadows, and we were lucky to get away, lucky to escape with our lives. But I'll never forget that night, never forget the terror, and I'll never go back to Whispering Creek, not ever. Story 9. It was the summer of '84, and the air hung thick and heavy like wet wool. Sneed's Ferry, back then, wasn't much more than a scattering of houses around the inlet, clinging to the edge of the woods and those godforsaken swamps. Gloomy Pond. Even the name of the place should have told us something was wrong. It wasn't gloomy in a sad way, but in a watching kind of way, like the trees themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something bad to happen. It started subtle, easy to dismiss. Chickens gone missing. Garden patches raided in the night, not like deer or raccoons do, but ripped apart, scattered. Folks started locking their sheds tighter, keeping dogs closer to the house at night. Then came the screaming. Lord, that screaming. It wasn't animal. I know animal sounds. Foxes, panthers even. We'd heard them all before. This was different. Higher pitched sometimes, like a woman in terrible pain, but then deeper, guttural, almost broken. It would echo from the direction of Gloomy Pond, usually late at night or just before dawn, cut right through the humid air and settle in your gut like a stone. For weeks it was like this. Stolen livestock, ruined crops, the screams. People started talking, whispering mostly at first. Some said it was a panther bigger than any we'd seen. Others, the more religious types, spoke of devils and bad omens. Then Old Man Hemlock, who claimed he knew about such things from his days down in the Everglades, he said it was a wild man. We laughed at him mostly. Wild man sounded like something from a dime novel. But then more things happened. One morning, Jebediah found his barn door ripped off its hinges, not broken, but ripped clean off, like it had been done by something with impossible strength. Nothing stolen from the barn, just destroyed. And the screams were getting closer, bolder. Folks started seeing things, fleeting glimpses at the edge of the woods, something tall, dark, moving too fast for a bear. Fear, real fear, began to creep in. It wasn't just about chickens anymore, or even the garden. It was about something else, something we couldn't understand. Rumors flew around like sparks from a blacksmith's forge. A crazy man escaped from the asylum up in Chattahoochee, some said. A Native American spirit cursed to roam the woods. Whatever it was, people were scared. Scared to go out after dark, scared to let their kids play too far from the house, scared to even sleep soundly. My pa, Thomas, he was a farmer, stubborn as an oak stump. He lost a whole row of corn one night, stalks pulled up and scattered like they were weeds. That was the last straw for him. He called a meeting down at the church. Half the town showed up, faces grim, carrying lanterns and shotguns. Pastor John tried to calm everyone down, talk about prayer and faith, but nobody was listening. The fear had taken hold, and it was growing like mold in the damp. Pa stood up on a crate, his face tight, and said, "We can't live like this. We're being terrorized in our own homes. We need to do something." He looked around at the faces, all hardened by fear and anger. "We need a posse." A murmur went through the crowd. Posse. Like in the stories, the ones about cowboys and outlaws. It felt serious, final. And that's what we were, serious and desperate. By sunup the next morning, the posse was formed. About 15 of us, mostly men, but a few women too, those who were good shots and braver than most men I knew. We had horses, some borrowed boats, and every rifle, shotgun and pistol folks could lay their hands on. Pa was the de facto leader, just by sheer grit and stubbornness. He divided us into groups, some to ride along the edges of the woods, some to take boats into the creeks leading to Gloomy Pond, others to track on foot. My job was to stay with the boat group, alongside old Silas, who knew the waterways like the back of his hand. The morning air was heavy with humidity, the sky overcast. The kind of day where the shadows seemed deeper and every sound was amplified. We pushed our small boats out onto the creek, the paddles dipping in the murky water, the only sound besides the nervous chirping of birds. The creek was narrow, lined with cypress trees dripping moss, the water black as ink. The smell of damp earth and rotting leaves hung in the air, thick and cloying. It was a place that felt ancient, untouched, and definitely not meant for people. Silas, He was a wiry old man, with eyes that had seen too much, or maybe just knew too much about the woods. He kept chewing tobacco, spitting brown juice into the creek every few minutes. "We're going into his territory now," he mumbled, mostly to himself. "He ain't gonna like that." My heart was hammering in my chest. I was scared, no denying it. I'd shot rabbits, squirrels, even a deer once or twice, but nothing like this. This was hunting something unknown, something that screamed like a person but moved like, well, we didn't know how it moved, just that it was fast and strong. We went deeper into the creek, the trees closing in above us, the light dimming to a green-tinged gloom. The air grew still, silent except for the drip, drip, drip of water from the moss. Even the birds had gone quiet. It was like the whole woods was holding its breath again. Suddenly, a sound, a rustling in the underbrush on the bank to our right. Everyone froze, paddles stilled, rifles raised. My breath caught in my throat. It could be anything, a deer, a wild hog, a raccoon. But in the back of my mind, the scream echoed, and I knew somehow it wasn't just an animal. The rustling moved again, closer now, louder. Branches snapped, then silence. Just the dripping water and the pounding of my own heart in my ears. Silas raised a hand, pointing towards the bank. Slowly, cautiously, we edged the boats closer. We were just about parallel to the spot where we'd heard the noise when it happened. A blur of movement. Something crashed through the brush, not running, but lunging. Not on all fours, but upright, tall, dark, covered in hair. It was so fast, so unexpected, it took a moment for my mind to catch up with what my eyes were seeing. It was like a nightmare come to life. Taller than a man, maybe 7 feet, maybe more, hunched over, but definitely upright, covered in thick, matted hair, dark brown, almost black, hanging down in clumps. It had long arms that swung low, almost to the ground, and the face. I only got a glimpse of the face. It was mostly hidden by the hair, but I saw a flash of skin, pale, and eyes, wide, wild, and something else, empty. Not animal empty, but vacant, like something was missing from behind them. It roared. Not a growl, not a scream, but a roar, a deep chest-shaking sound that vibrated in the air, in my bones. It was the sound of pure rage, pure animal fury. But it wasn't animal. That was the terrifying part. It was something else. It charged out of the brush, not at us in the boats, but across the creek, heading deeper into the woods. It moved with incredible speed, leaping over logs, pushing through bushes, gone in seconds, leaving only the echo of its roar and the swaying of the disturbed undergrowth. Everyone in the boats was stunned silent for a moment. Then the adrenaline hit. Guns were firing blindly into the woods, uselessly. Silas yelled, "Stop! Stop wasting bullets! We gotta track it!" We pulled the boats to the bank and scrambled out, stumbling on the muddy ground. The others in the boats, Jed and young Thomas Jr., they were ashen-faced, eyes wide with fear. Even Silas, old and hardened as he was, looked shaken. We followed the trail, or what we thought was the trail. Broken branches, crushed leaves, disturbed earth. It was moving fast, but it was clumsy too, like it wasn't used to moving on 2 legs, or maybe it was just panicked. We tracked it for what felt like hours, pushing deeper and deeper into the swamp, the air thick with the smell of decay, the buzzing of insects deafening in the humid stillness. The woods grew darker, more tangled, the ground wetter, sucking at our boots with every step. The other groups, on horseback and on foot, we'd lost contact with them hours ago. It was just us now, Silas, Jed, Thomas Jr. and me, swallowed by the Gloomy Pond swamp. We came to a clearing, a small patch of muddy ground surrounded by thickets of reeds and stunted pines. And there it was. Standing in the middle of the clearing, facing away from us, was the wild man. It hadn't gone far after all. Maybe it was trapped or tired or just cornered. It stood still, hunched over, its long hair hanging down, obscuring its back. It looked smaller, somehow, from behind. Less terrifying. Almost pathetic. Silas raised his rifle, slowly, deliberately. Jed and Thomas Jr. did too, their hands shaking. My own rifle felt heavy, useless. I couldn't pull the trigger, not like this. Not on something that looked lost. Silas took a step forward. "All right, creature," he said, his voice surprisingly calm. "It's over. Just stand still." The wild man didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, still as a statue. Silas took another step. "Turn around, slow and easy. Let us see your face." Still nothing, just the silence, the buzzing insects, the drip of water from the trees. It was unbearable, that silence, broken only by our ragged breaths. Silas stepped closer, almost within rifle range now. "I said turn around," he yelled, his voice cracking with tension. And then it turned, slowly, deliberately, turning its whole body, inch by inch. It was like watching a tree creak and sway in a slow wind. And as it turned, the hair on its face parted just enough for us to see. And what we saw wasn't what I expected. It wasn't a monster, not in the way I'd imagined. It wasn't some fanged beast, some demonic creature from hell. It was human, or almost human. The face was pale, gaunt, hollow-cheeked. The eyes, those wide, wild eyes, they weren't empty like I thought before. They were filled with something else, fear, terror, and confusion, like it didn't understand what was happening. It was a man. A wild man, yes, covered in hair and dirt and God knows what else, but it was a man, a human being, and looking into those eyes I knew deep down it wasn't evil. It was just lost. Then Silas fired. The shot echoed through the woods, deafeningly loud, ripping through the stillness. The wild man flinched, jumped, but didn't fall. Silas had aimed for the leg, to disable it, not kill it. Jed and Thomas Jr. fired too, clumsily, wildly. The wild man cried out, not a roar this time, but a whimper, a human whimper. It stumbled, tried to run, but its leg was injured. It collapsed to the muddy ground, thrashing, whimpering, its eyes wide with pain and terror. We rushed forward, guns still raised, but now our hands were shaking even harder. Silas approached cautiously, his rifle still pointed at the creature. "Hold still," he commanded, but his voice was rough, uncertain. The wildman lay there, panting, bleeding from its leg. It looked up at us, its eyes pleading, confused. It tried to speak, to say something, but only a garbled sound came out, a mix of groans and whimpers. We tied it up, rope we'd brought just in case. It didn't fight back, didn't resist. It just lay there, trembling, its eyes fixed on us with a mixture of fear and something else. Maybe hope. We got it back to town, dragged and half-carried, the whole way silent, nobody speaking. The only sound the creature's ragged breathing and the squelch of our boots in the mud. When we emerged from the woods, the whole town was waiting. They stared, silent, shocked. They expected a monster, a devil. But they saw this. A wild, hairy, injured man, more animal than human, but still undeniably human. They put it in the church for the night, tied up in the corner, guarded by men with shotguns. People came to see it, whispering, pointing, their fear mixed with a strange kind of pity. They brought food, water. The wildman wouldn't eat, wouldn't drink. It just sat there, huddled in on itself, eyes downcast. Nobody knew who it was, where it came from. Nobody in Sneed's Ferry had ever seen him before. We checked with the surrounding towns, asked about missing people, asylum escapees. Nothing. It was like he'd appeared out of nowhere, out of the swamp itself. The next day, they took him to Chattahoochee, the asylum. Said they'd figure out who he was, what to do with him. I watched them take him away, that wild man, that lost soul, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd done something wrong. That we'd caught something broken, something scared, and locked it away instead of helping it. I never heard what happened to him in Chattahoochee. The story of the Gloomy Pond wildman faded, became a legend, a campfire tale to scare children. But I remember those eyes, those confused, terrified human eyes, and I still hear that whimper in my dreams sometimes, echoing from the depths of Gloomy Pond, and I still wonder, what exactly did we catch that day? And did we catch a monster, or just a man lost too long in the wild? I don't know. I really don't. And that's the thing that still gets to me, even now, all these years later. We caught him all right, but we never really figured out what we caught. Story 10. I drove out in my old pickup, that Ford, beat-up thing but reliable, you know, headed out towards Forest Road 50. You know the area? Real desolate part of the Okala National Forest, near Shadow Island. Always had an eerie feeling about that place, Shadow Island. Name itself sends shivers, but needed firewood, and that's where I usually went. Figured on a Tuesday, middle of the week, middle of the day, wouldn't be a soul around to bother me. Just me, the trees, and the buzz of the saw. Parked up just off the road where the trees started getting thick and got my chainsaw out. Old thing, but powerful enough. Fired it up, that ear-splitting whine always gets the blood pumping, doesn't it? Started on a nice thick oak, figuring it'd split easy enough. Must have only been at it for about 15 minutes, maybe 20, when the chain, damn thing, it just flew right off, snapped, just like that. Cussed under my breath, fiddled around with it. No getting around it, had to fix it properly. Frustration boiling up, heat bearing down, sweat running rivers. Reached for my water jug in the truck, thirsty as hell. Leaned into the cab, grabbed it, took a good swig. That's when I heard it. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. Not a dog, not a bear, not even a gator. And Lord knows, we got our share of gators out in Okala. This was deeper, guttural, like something huge clearing its throat, but angrier. A growl, yeah, a deep growl, resonated right in my chest. Erupted from the woods just a little ways in, maybe 50, 60 feet. Hard to say exactly. Sound in the woods. It plays tricks. My blood ran cold. Stopped breathing practically. Just stood there, water jug halfway to my mouth, listening. Heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint where it came from, trying to see anything moving in the thick undergrowth. Saw palmettos everywhere, tangled vines, dark shadows under the cypress trees, even in the midday sun. Couldn't see a damn thing. Silence. Just the hum of the forest, insects buzzing, faint breeze rustling the leaves, and my heart pounding in my ears. That's all I could really hear. After a minute, maybe two, just holding my breath, I started breathing again, shallow breaths at first. Figured maybe it was some kind of wildcat, bobcat maybe, but it didn't sound like any bobcat I'd ever heard. Too big, too mean-sounding. Shook my head, tried to rationalize it away. Probably just an animal protecting its territory. Didn't sound like it was coming any closer. Figured, best to get back to work, get this wood chopped and get on home. Didn't want to linger in the woods any longer than I had to. So I got back to fiddling with the chainsaw. Took a while, got my hands greasy and scratched up, wrestling with that chain. Finally got it back on, tightened it up, everything seemed right. Checked the oil, the gas, started her up again, fired right up, thank the Lord. Started sawing again, a little jumpier this time, I admit. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig had me on edge, kept glancing back over my shoulder at the woods, expecting, I don't know what exactly. Expecting to see something, I guess. That thing that growled. Never saw anything, though. Just shadows and trees. Worked for another 15 minutes, maybe. Sweat was pouring off me now. Sun was relentless, and the humidity was just brutal. Started feeling lightheaded, honestly. And then, wouldn't you know it? Same thing happened again. Chain flew off. Damn chainsaw was cursed, I swear. That was it. Enough was enough. I was hot, tired, frustrated, and frankly, more than a little spooked by that growl. Didn't feel right to be out there anymore. Decision made, packing up and heading home. Firewood could wait. My peace of mind couldn't. Switched off the saw, threw it in the back of the truck bed, gathered up my tools, the wrench, the screwdriver, tossed them in too. Slammed the tailgate shut, got in the cab, started her up, put her in gear, started driving back down Forest Road 50, wanting nothing more than a cold glass of iced tea in my recliner. Wasn't going fast. The road was rough, unpaved, lots of bumps and dips. Rounding a bend in the road, a slow curve to the left. I saw it. Stopped the truck dead in its tracks. Stalled even, just stared. Couldn't believe my eyes. It was standing there, just off the side of the road, maybe 20, 30 feet in a thick patch of saw palmetto. Standing upright, like a man, but not a man. It was huge. Taller than any man I'd ever seen. Taller than any man could be. 8 feet. Easy. Maybe more. Built like a brick outhouse, my daddy used to say about strong men. This thing was built like a mountain. Gorilla, that's the word that jumped into my head. Like those pictures you see in National Geographic. But wrong. So wrong. Covered in hair. Dark hair, black or deep brown, thick, shaggy looking. All over, head to toe, except its arms. From the elbows down, the arms were different. Less hairy, more human-looking almost. Like a gorilla, but stretched out. Longer. It was facing me, standing straight up, facing my truck. Head up, staring right at me, and the face, Lord, that face. Smooth, flat, dark, almost leathery looking. No snout like a dog or a bear. Flat like a man's face, but different. Pug nose, like squashed in. And the eyes, deep set, dark. Couldn't see the color, just deep shadows where eyes should be. But I could feel them looking at me. Staring. Intense. My heart, I thought it was going to beat right out of my chest. Pounding, pounding, pounding. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to run, drive, get the hell out of there. But I was frozen, stuck, mesmerized, terrified. For a second, just a second, I thought, bear? Could it be a bear standing on its hind legs? But no, no way. Bears don't stand like that. Not like that thing was standing. Upright, confident, powerful. And the face, not a bear face. Wrong shape, wrong everything. Gorilla. Again, that word slammed into my brain. But bigger, scarier, and wrong somehow. Wildly wrong. I don't know how long I stood there staring at it. Felt like an eternity, maybe only a minute. Time seemed to warp, twist, stop. Just me and that creature, staring at each other across that dusty forest road. Then instinct took over. Stupid instinct maybe, but instinct nonetheless. Defense. Gotta defend myself. Stupid. What was I gonna do against that? With what? The axe. I had my axe in the back of the truck. Used it sometimes to split bigger logs. It was in the truck bed, right there. Without thinking, without even taking my eyes off the thing, I reached for the door handle, pushed it open, swung my legs out, scrambled out of the cab. Moved like I was underwater, slow motion, every muscle screaming. Didn't take my eyes off it, not for a second. Kept staring right at it, back of the truck. Tailgate, stumbled around to the back, heart hammering. Reached into the truck bed, groped around, fingers brushed against the cold steel of the axe handle, grabbed it, felt the weight of it in my hand, pathetic against that, but it was something, anything. Axe in hand, I turned back, ready to what? I don't know. Swing it at an 8-foot-tall thing? Madness. But I was running on pure adrenaline, pure terror, had to do something, turned back to face it. It was gone, just gone. Empty saw palmetto bushes, empty trees behind them, just forest. Nothing there. Stared. Axe dangling uselessly in my hand, stared at the spot where it had been standing, just gone, like it had vanished into thin air, swallowed by the woods, lowered the axe, slowly, swallowed. Tried to breathe, but my lungs felt tight, like they were full of lead. Walked slowly towards the edge of the road to where it had been standing, looked down at the ground. Pine needles, dirt, dry leaves, no tracks, nothing, just Forest floor, like nothing had ever been there. Searched. Crazy, I know, but I searched. Walked into the edge of the woods, pushing through the sore palmettos, looking for what? Tracks? Signs of it going deeper into the forest? Anything. Nothing. Just more forest, more trees, more shadows. No tracks, no broken branches, no sign that anything that it had ever been there, like a ghost, just appeared, stared at me, and then gone. I stood there for a long time. I don't know how long, just staring into the woods, listening, waiting. Heart still pounding, hands shaking, every muscle in my body tense, waiting for it to reappear. It didn't. Finally, slowly, I backed away, still looking at the woods. Got back in my truck, slammed the door, locked it. Felt stupid even locking it. Like a lock was going to stop that, put the truck in gear, put my foot down hard on the gas, and just drove. Drove as fast as that old pickup could go down that bumpy road. Didn't stop, didn't look back, just drove. Until I was back on the paved road, back on familiar ground, away from Forest Road 50, away from Shadow Island, away from it. Got home, sat down in my recliner, and just sat there, staring blankly, shaking. Didn't say a word to Sarah when she asked what was wrong, just couldn't. Didn't even know where to begin, didn't sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face, that flat, dark face. Those deep-set eyes, staring. Next day, word got around town somehow. You know how small towns are. Gossip travels faster than lightning. Folks started asking me, down at the feed store, after church on Sunday. Reverend Cartwright, heard you saw something out on Forest Road 50. Heard you saw a monster. Heard you saw Bigfoot. Bigfoot. That's what they started calling it. Laughing, mocking, calling me crazy. Old Reverend Cartwright's lost his mind out in the woods. Too much sun, maybe, too much preaching. I tried to explain, tried to tell them what I saw, but words failed me. How do you describe something like that? Something that shouldn't exist, something that defies explanation. Most folks just chuckled, patted me on the back, said I was imagining things. Some of the older ones, the ones who grew up in these woods, they looked at me different, looked at me like they knew I'd seen something real, something they maybe half believed in already, deep down. Didn't change my mind, didn't make me doubt what I saw, all the jokes and the disbelief. I know what I saw it, as clear as day. That thing, that creature, standing there in the woods, never went back to Forest Road 50, never chopped firewood out there again. Got my wood closer to town after that. Even avoided driving that way if I could help it. Shadow Island still gives me the chills just thinking about it. Never saw it again. Never heard anything like that growl again. Life went back to normal mostly, for everyone else. But for me, it was different. Something changed in me that day. That feeling of seeing something impossible. Something primal. Something that shouldn't be. Stays with you, you know, like a shadow, always there at the edge of your mind. Sometimes late at night when the wind is blowing through the trees outside my window, I hear things, rustles, snaps, shadows move in the corners of my eye, and I think, what if it's still out there, in the woods, watching, waiting? I don't know what it was I saw that day, I honestly don't, but I know it was real as you and me, and that's the part that gets to you, you know, the knowing that there are things out there in this world, things we can't explain, things we don't understand, things that are just out there. And you can come face to face with them just like that, out of nowhere, in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, and then they're just gone, leaving you with this feeling, this unease that never really goes away, never. Story 11. It was a rough time, that spring of '07. Divorce stuff is just draining. Everything felt raw and exposed, you know, like the world was suddenly too bright and too loud. I needed quiet. needed to breathe without feeling like there was a knot in my chest. So I started walking in the woods behind Pinewah. Manitoba's pretty remote, especially out where I was. Just woods for miles, stretching out from our little town. The woods were the only place I felt a bit normal again, if that makes sense. Early mornings were the best. Dawn just barely breaking. Everything still and cool. It was the only peace I could find. That morning was like any other at first. I got up before the sun properly peeked over the trees, grabbed a coffee thermos, and headed out. I always followed the same path, sort of an old logging trail that snaked down to the Serpent River Causeway. It's a pretty spot, even gloomy. Lots of granite rock, sharp cliffs dropping down to the water, the river itself always looking dark and deep. That day, the air was damp, that kind of spring damp that gets right into your bones. The woods smelled like wet earth and pine, that usual smell, but there was something else underneath, a kind of musky undertone that was a bit off-putting, though I couldn't place it then. I was walking, not really thinking about anything much, just letting the quiet soak in when I saw them. Snakes. Dead. Crushed on the path. Now, snakes are common enough in these woods, especially in the spring as things warm up. But not like this. These weren't just run over by a bike or something. They were mashed, flattened, like something heavy had deliberately stomped them. There were maybe 4 or 5 in a short stretch of path. It felt weird, you know, uneasy, like finding broken toys, too deliberate for just an accident. I picked up my pace a bit, just wanting to get past that section of the trail. The path opens up a bit as you get closer to the causeway, the trees thinning out, letting more light through even that early in the morning. That's when I saw it. At first I thought, bear. My brain just went there automatically. There was something big and dark down by the water's edge, maybe 200 feet away, near where the river widens out into a sort of small lake. It was squatting, like a bear would when it's, doing its business. It was facing away from me, towards the water, and honestly, for a split second, that's really all I thought it was. Just a bear having its morning pee or whatever. I slowed down even more. We have bears around here, black bears mostly, and while they usually leave you alone, you still don't want to just wander right up on one. I was thinking about making a bit of noise, maybe clapping my hands to let it know I was there, give it a chance to move off, when it started to stand up. And that's when the bear idea just shattered. It wasn't a bear, it was too tall. Way too tall. Even on all fours it had been big, bulky. But as it straightened up it just kept going, rising and rising until it was, I don't even know how tall. 8 feet. 9. More. It's impossible to say exactly, but it was enormous, towering. And it wasn't bulky like a bear anymore, it was human-shaped but all wrong. Wrong proportions, wrong everything. It was covered in hair, black hair, thick and matted looking. Not fur like an animal, but hair. Human-like hair, but everywhere. Its back was incredibly broad, its shoulders hunched forward even as it stood up straight. The muscles, they were like ropes, just bulging under the hair. It was like looking at a nightmare version of a man, twisted and gigantic. It turned its head then, slowly, and that's when I saw its face, or what passed for a face. It was still shadowed, the sun was barely up, and it was partly obscured by hair hanging down, but I saw enough. No snout, flat nose, or at least flatter than a bear, and the mouth. Oh God, the mouth. It wasn't open wide, not roaring or anything, but the lips were pulled back. Not in a smile, not in anything human, more like a grimace, and teeth, big, blunt, yellow-white teeth. They weren't neat and even like ours. They were jagged and wrong, like something from a prehistoric skull. It made a sound. Not a roar, not yet. It was a low growl, deep in its chest, rumbling out, and it vibrated right through me, even at that distance. It wasn't just a sound, it was a feeling, a threat. Instinct took over. I knew in that instant that this was not something I should be seeing, not something I was meant to see. Everything in me screamed, danger, get away. I started backing up slowly, keeping my eyes fixed on it. My heart was hammering, every beat a deafening drum in my ears, my breath hitched in my throat. I remember my hands were clammy, cold despite the damp morning air. And I was so stupidly grateful that I hadn't brought my dog Buster with me that day. He would have barked, rushed in, done something reckless. He wouldn't have understood the sheer wrongness of this thing. As I backed away, still staring at the creature, I noticed something else. Movement over to my left, deeper in the trees, darker shapes amongst the shadows, and then I saw it. Another one, or something like it. It was harder to see, tucked back in the denser woods, but it was there. Darker than the shadows, almost black, watching, unmoving. I could just make out the shape, the same hunched shoulders, the same sense of mass. There were two of them, maybe more, and I was right in the open on the edge of the trees, with the river behind me and the granite rock piles to either side of the path. My escape route, it was narrow. Way too narrow. I kept backing up, inch by agonizing inch. Every step felt like it took forever. My legs were shaking. I could feel the granite rocks pressing in on both sides of the path now. The causeway was like a funnel closing in on me. The first creature, the one by the water, hadn't moved much. It was still watching me, head cocked slightly like it was curious or toying with me. The other one in the trees was still just a dark presence, felt more than seen. And then it happened. The roar. Not from the one by the water, not from the shadows. It came from right in front of me, from further down the path, deeper in the woods. It exploded out of the trees, deafening. A roar that wasn't animal, wasn't human, but something in between, something monstrous. It was so loud, so sudden, it physically slammed into me. I flinched, stumbled back, almost tripped on the uneven ground. And then, from my right, from behind one of the big granite rock piles, something reached out. An arm, but not like any arm I'd ever seen. Massive, thick as my torso, covered in hair, auburn hair this time. Longer, coarser hair than the black one. And the hand. It was like a grotesque parody of a human hand. The fingers were thick, sausage-like, the knuckles swollen, huge. The nails, they weren't nails, they were claws. Dull, thick, but definitely claws. It reached out, reaching for me, slowly, deliberately, like it had all the time in the world, like I was some kind of insect trapped in a jar. I could see the muscle flexing in that arm as it extended, the sheer power of it. I was trapped. Front, side, back, maybe even more of them in the trees, surrounded. Panic finally broke, my brain short-circuited. I didn't scream, no sound came out of my throat, just pure animal terror. I turned, didn't even think about it, just turned and ran. Backward at first, stumbling, tripping, nearly falling, then twisted around and ran forward, away from the arm, away from the rocks, back the way I'd come. I didn't look back, didn't dare. I just ran, blindly, desperately, adrenaline screaming through my veins. I don't even remember the path, just the feeling of branches whipping past my face, the pounding of my feet on the ground, the raw, gasping breaths in my lungs. I ran and ran and ran until my legs burned, my chest ached, my vision swam. Finally, I burst out of the woods, stumbled onto the dirt road leading back to town, collapsing onto the rough gravel. I couldn't run anymore, couldn't breathe, couldn't even stand. I dry heaved, vomited nothing but coffee and bile onto the dusty road. Kept heaving, even when there was nothing left, shaking uncontrollably. It felt like hours before I could even stand up again, let alone walk. When I finally did, my legs were jelly. Every muscle in my body was screaming. I walked back to town like a zombie. Didn't see anyone, thank God. Just got home, locked the door, drew the curtains and sat. Just sat there in the dark, shaking, staring at nothing. I didn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? Bigfoot in Manitoba? They'd think I'd finally cracked from the divorce stress. Besides, I didn't want to talk about it. Didn't want to bring it into words, make it real in the everyday world. It felt profane somehow, like saying its name would give it power. The woods, they're not the same anymore, not my place of peace. Every time I even think about going back there, I get that same icy knot in my stomach, the same prickle of fear on my skin. I still walk sometimes, need to get out, but I stick to the roads now, to the open fields. Never go near the Serpent River Causeway again. Never will. I know what I saw. 3 of them, maybe more. And it wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything normal. It was something else. Something ancient and powerful and terrifying. Something that shouldn't exist, but does. And I saw it. They saw me. And I got away. Barely. Sometimes late at night when everything is quiet, I still hear that roar in my head. Feel the weight of those eyes on me. See that hand reaching out. And I wonder, what if I hadn't run? What if I'd hesitated just a second longer? What would have happened then? I don't know. And I don't ever want to find out. I just keep walking the roads, living with the fear, with the image burned into my mind. Living with the knowledge that out there, in the quiet darkness of the woods, they're still there, watching, waiting, and nobody knows, nobody believes. And that's maybe the scariest part of all. Story 12. Okay, so, this is going to sound insane. I know it. Anyone reading this, you're going to think I'm making it up, or that I saw a bear and got freaked out or something. But I swear to God, this is what happened to me and my friend Noah back in '93. I've never really told anyone the whole thing, not properly. Even Noah and I, we mostly just don't talk about it. It's like this unspoken thing. But reading some of the stories on here, well, it felt like maybe someone else might get it. It was August, real hot summer day in Alberta. We were camping in Jasper National Park, just a couple of young guys, you know, thinking we were all tough and outdoorsy. We were up for a hike, figured we'd check out one of the trails that ran along a creek. I can't remember the name of it now. It's been too long. But I remember it was supposed to be a pretty easy trail, scenic views and all that. We set off early, must have been around 7 in the morning, maybe a bit earlier. The air was still cool, that kind of crisp mountain air. Sun was just starting to peek over the peaks, throwing long shadows across the path. Everything was quiet, except for the sound of the creek burbling alongside the trail. We were talking, just normal guy stuff, probably about girls or sports or whatever. Completely relaxed, not a care in the world. Then we heard it. This sound, coming from off the trail, deeper in the woods. It was weird, like nothing I'd ever heard before, or since, to be honest. It wasn't an animal I recognized. Not a bear, not a wolf, not a deer or an elk. It wasn't like a growl or a bark or a howl. It was more of a hooting sound is the only way I can describe it. Like a deep, guttural whoosh, but with this strange kind of resonance to it. Low, but you could feel it more than hear it. We both stopped dead in our tracks, went silent immediately, looked at each other, eyebrows raised like, "Did you hear that?" Noah nodded, his eyes already getting wider. It came again, the same sound, maybe a bit closer this time. It definitely sounded like it was coming from within the trees, dense woods on the other side of the trail, sloping up the side of the valley. Curiosity, you know. Stupid curiosity. We should have just kept walking, pretended we didn't hear anything, turned around, anything. But we didn't. We were young and dumb and thought it would be cool to check it out. "Maybe it's a bear," Noah whispered, but he didn't sound convinced. I sure as hell wasn't. Bears don't make sounds like that. So, cautiously we stepped off the trail, into the woods. It got darker instantly under the trees. The sunlight was blocked out by the canopy above, and it was thicker in there than it looked from the path. Bushes and undergrowth everywhere. We started pushing our way through, branches scratching at our arms and faces. We were moving slowly, real slow, listening for the sound again, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. It came a third time, closer still. This time it sounded louder and almost irritated. I don't know if that makes sense for a sound, but it did. Like whatever was making it wasn't happy. A shiver went down my spine. Even then, we should have turned back. But we'd come this far, and the stupid curiosity was winning out over the growing sense of unease. We pushed through another thick patch of brush, and suddenly we were in a small clearing. Sunlight filtered down in patches through the leaves, and that's when we saw it. I can still see it, clear as day, in my head, even after all these years, standing there maybe 20-30 feet away in the dappled sunlight. It was huge, just unbelievably huge, taller than anything I could have imagined. I'd guess 9 feet, easy, maybe even taller. It was like a man, but not a man, if that makes sense. Shaped like a man, stood upright, 2 arms, 2 legs, head on top. But not human. It was covered in hair, dark hair, matted, thick, all over, head to toe, except maybe its face. I couldn't see its face clearly at first. It was facing away from us, slightly angled, like it was looking at something on the ground, or in the trees deeper into the clearing. Its back was to us mostly, and it was massive, broader than any man I've ever seen. Built like they say gorillas are built, only bigger, way bigger, like a brick wall made of muscle and hair. For a second, we just stood there, frozen, staring, mouths probably hanging open, complete and utter shock. My brain just couldn't process what I was seeing. It was like my eyes were sending me information my brain refused to believe. Then it moved, just slightly, shifted its weight or turned its head, I can't remember exactly, and that's when it saw us. Slowly, deliberately, it turned its head towards us. It turned its whole body then, slowly, powerfully, like turning a massive oak tree, that slow, deliberate strength. And it looked at us. Its face, I can't describe its face properly. It was hairy still, but you could see the skin underneath was dark. Features were heavy. Brow ridge was huge, jutting out. Nose was flat, wide. Mouth was just a slit, really, under all the hair. But its eyes, Jesus Christ, its eyes, they were dark, deep dark brown, almost black. And they were intelligent. That's the thing that freaked me out the most, I think. They weren't animal eyes. They weren't just blank, or wild, or scared, or whatever you expect from a wild animal. They were aware, calculating. There was something in those eyes, something cold, something intelligent, but feral, yeah, that's the word, feral intelligence, like it understood everything, but it was still completely wild and angry. There was pure, raw anger in those eyes, looking at us. My blood turned to ice. I mean, absolute ice. Everything in me just screamed danger, primal fear, like I'd never felt before, like I was staring into something that was ancient and dangerous and completely beyond anything I understood. It wasn't just fear of being attacked. It was a deeper fear. A fear of something fundamentally wrong being in front of me, something that shouldn't exist. I don't know what Noah saw in its eyes, but I saw the same thing in his face. Terror. Complete, unadulterated terror. His face went white as a sheet. His eyes were wide, pupils dilated. He looked like he was about to pass out. And then, without a word, without even a sound, we both just ran. We turned and ran. Full sprint, back the way we came, through the brush, crashing through branches, tripping over roots. Didn't say a word, didn't even look back, just ran, like our lives depended on it. Because I think, in that moment, we both knew they did. I don't know how long we ran. Felt like forever. Felt like my lungs were going to explode. My legs were burning. Branches whipped at my face, tore at my clothes. I could hear Noah crashing through the trees behind me, but I didn't stop, couldn't stop. And then I heard it. Behind us, the sound of something moving in the woods, something big, crashing through the trees, snapping branches, heavy footfalls on the ground. It was coming after us, the creature. It was chasing us, the sound of it. That's another thing I'll never forget. It wasn't like an animal chasing you. It was heavier, more powerful, like a bulldozer moving through the forest. And fast. Jesus, it was fast. For something that big, it was unbelievably fast. I glanced back once, just for a split second. I shouldn't have, but I did. And I saw it, through the trees, moving, still coming. It looked massive even from a distance, and it was closing on us, faster than I thought possible. I dug deeper, ran faster, pushed harder, adrenaline pumping like crazy. My heart was hammering in my chest, pounding in my ears. I could hear my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear Noah behind me, still crashing through the undergrowth, and I could hear the creature behind us, still coming. Always coming. It felt like it chased us for miles. Probably wasn't actually that far, maybe only 20 minutes like you said, but it felt like an eternity. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a branch sounded like it was right behind me, about to grab me. I kept expecting to feel a hand on my shoulder, a claw in my back. And the thing is, it could have caught us. I know it could have. It was faster, stronger. It was moving through the woods like it was nothing. We were just clumsy humans, stumbling, falling, scrambling. If it had really wanted to catch us, it could have, but it didn't. It just kept chasing, driving us, pushing us, like it wasn't trying to kill us, just scare us, terrify us. And Jesus Christ, it worked. I've never been so scared in my life. Finally, we burst out of the trees and back onto the trail. Sunlight again, open space. The trail was empty, blessedly empty. We didn't stop running, though. We kept going for another 100 yards, maybe more, before we finally collapsed. Against a tree trunk, gasping for air, shaking, sweating, trying to catch our breath, trying to calm down, trying to understand what the hell had just happened. We sat there for a long time, didn't say much, just looked at each other, wild-eyed, panting. The silence of the forest seemed deafening after the chase. The creek still babbled peacefully alongside the trail, like nothing had happened, like the world hadn't just turned upside down. Eventually we started talking, hesitantly at first, just whispers. Did you see that?" Noah finally managed to say, voice still shaky. I nodded, unable to speak. What could I say? "Yeah, I saw it. I saw that." We talked about it then, trying to make sense of it, trying to explain it to ourselves. But we couldn't. We couldn't find words. It was just unbelievable, impossible. And yet we'd both seen it, felt the fear, heard the chase. It was real. It had been real. Hours later, when we'd calmed down a bit, when the initial shock had worn off, a kind of morbid curiosity started to creep in again. Stupid curiosity. The same thing that got us into trouble in the first place. But we couldn't shake it. We had to know. We had to see if there was anything there, anything left. So stupidly, recklessly, we went back, late afternoon by then. Sun was starting to get lower in the sky, shadows getting longer. We went back to the spot where we'd seen it, walked back up the trail, slowly this time, quietly, listened for any sounds, nothing, just the normal forest noises. We went off the trail again, back into the woods. To the clearing, it looked different in the afternoon light, less menacing somehow, but still empty, or seemed empty at first. Then we saw them, in the mud, near the creek bed, where the ground was softer. Footprints, but not footprints like any human footprints. Gigantic footprints, enormous, way bigger than any bear track we'd ever seen, bigger than anything, long and wide, definitely two-legged, definitely humanoid-shaped, but massively out of proportion. They were clear in the mud, deep impressions. You could see the toes, sort of. 3 or 4, maybe? Hard to tell exactly, but they were huge, just monstrously huge. And there wasn't just one set. There were multiple sets, overlapping, going in different directions, at least two, maybe more. Two of them at least, just like the premise said, right? Two of those things. Looking at those tracks, that was almost worse than seeing the creature itself, because it made it real, tangible, proof that we hadn't imagined it, proof that we hadn't been hallucinating or seeing things, proof that something huge and unknown had chased us through the woods. We stared at those tracks, just stared, silent, lost for words again. The fear came back, creeping back up my spine, the chills, the goosebumps. We'd been that close to them, to those things. And then, just as we were standing there, staring at the footprints, the sky opened up. Suddenly, out of nowhere, rain started pouring down, heavy, thick rain, like a cloudburst. We looked up, surprised, but then we looked down again at the footprints, and we watched, helpless, as the rain started to wash them away. Slowly at first, then faster and faster. The mud turning to mush, the edges of the prints blurring, dissolving, washing away the evidence, washing away the proof. Within minutes, they were gone, completely gone. Just muddy ground, wet leaves, and the pouring rain. Like they'd never been there, like we'd imagined the whole thing. We stood there in the rain for a minute, just numb. Then we turned and walked back to the trail, back to our campsite, without saying anything. Just the sound of the rain and our footsteps and the rushing creek. We packed up our camp the next morning and left Jasper. Didn't say a word about it to anyone at the park. Didn't file any reports. Didn't tell the rangers. We just left. Like we were running away from something, which I guess we were, and we've never really talked about it since. Not properly. We've mentioned it, in passing sometimes, years later. A joke, maybe. Remember that bear we saw in Jasper? A nervous laugh. But we both know. We both remember. We both saw what we saw. And to this day, I have no idea what it was. Bigfoot? Sasquatch? Some other thing? I don't know. Don't want to know, maybe. Part of me just wants to pretend it never happened. That it was just a trick of the light, a weird sound, a vivid hallucination brought on by mountain air and too much sun. But I know it wasn't. I know what I saw. We both do. And the fear was real. The chase was real. Those footprints were real. And sometimes late at night when I'm lying in bed, in the dark and quiet, I still hear that sound, that hooding sound, in my head, and I see those eyes, those cold, intelligent, feral eyes, staring at me, and I get that same chill, that same primal fear, all over again, like it just happened yesterday, like it's still out there, watching, waiting, and I can't explain it, I just can't. Story 13. Work had been brutal that day. Double shift because some fella called in sick, and Mr. Abernathy, the foreman, he's not one to cut you any slack. By the time I clocked out, I was ready to fall face first into my bed and sleep for a week. But home was still a good hour's drive, minimum, and that night it felt like 10. The rain was drumming on the Ford's roof, loud enough to almost drown out the engine. The road was twisting and turning. You know how it is out here. Hugging the mountains, with drops so deep on one side you don't want to think about them. Normally, I enjoy driving at night. There's a peace to it, even in the rain, just you and the road and the hum of the engine. But this night felt different, heavy, like the air itself was thick and pressing down. I was somewhere between Sweet Home and Pinho, closer to Beaver Falls, maybe a mile or two past the old Black Creek Bridge. It's a stretch of road that always felt a bit lonely, even during the day. Trees crowding close to the edge, thick forest on both sides, blocking out most of the sky even when it wasn't cloudy. At night, in the rain, it was like driving through a tunnel made of shadows. I remember taking a bend, not too sharp, but enough that you had to slow down a touch. And that's when my headlights caught something on the side of the road. At first, I just thought it was a deer, maybe, standing too close to the shoulder. But even before I got closer, Something felt off, wrong. Deer don't stand like that. I eased off the gas, squinting through the rain-streaked windshield. My heart started to pick up a little. It was big, whatever it was, darker than the trees somehow, hulking, and it was moving. Or at least, it had moved as my lights hit it, because now it was still. Just there, by the edge of the woods, half in the ditch, half out. As I crept closer, my headlights painted a clearer picture, and that's when the cold hit me. Not just the rain cold, but a deep, bone-chilling kind of cold that started in my stomach and spread out to my fingertips. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't an animal I'd ever seen or ever even imagined. It was shaped like a man, in a way. Tall, taller than any man I ever met, maybe 7, 8 feet easy. But that's where the man shape ended. The rest, I don't even know how to describe it right. It was dark, darker than shadows, almost blacker than black, like it was swallowing the light around it. And it was bulky, not muscle bulk, but just mass, heavy, shapeless mass. It was hard to make out details in the rain and the dark, but it didn't look smooth. It looked rough, uneven, almost warty, gnarled, like bark but not bark, something flesh-like but not right, and it had something in its arms. My first thought, stupid as it sounds now, was that it was carrying a log. Maybe some drunk lumberjack had stumbled off the road and was hauling wood in the middle of the night, for reasons I couldn't fathom. But even as that thought flickered through my brain, I knew it wasn't right. Logs don't have hair. As I got closer, another wave of cold sweat washed over me. The thing it was carrying wasn't a log. It was limp, dangling, and from underneath the bulky arm holding it, long, pale strands were hanging down. Hair, grey hair. My mind went blank for a split second. Just nothing. Then it came crashing back, and with it, a name. Elsie. Elsie, the goat lady. Old woman who lived in that little cabin up near Beaver Creek. Eccentric, they called her. Kept to herself, raised goats. Harmless old soul. But she'd been gone, vanished, disappeared about a week ago. Sheriff's office had put out a notice, asked folks to keep an eye out, but nobody had seen hide nor hair of her. And now, this thing, in the middle of nowhere, in the pouring rain, holding something that looked awfully damn like a body with long grey hair hanging down. My foot froze on the gas pedal. I was creeping forward, slower and slower, and I knew I should stop. I knew I should turn around, get the hell out of there. But something, some morbid curiosity, some sick dread, kept me going. I had to know. I had to see. I was maybe 20, 30 feet away now. The Ford's engine was just a low rumble. The rain was still pounding. And the thing, it hadn't moved. It was just standing there, massive and dark, in the beam of my headlights. I strained my eyes, trying to see more detail, but it was like my eyes were refusing to focus. Like my brain was screaming, "Don't look, don't look." But I looked. I forced myself to look. The hair was definitely grey, long and tangled, wet and plastered together in clumps, and underneath it I could see a pale shape, a shape that could be a head, dangling upside down. The angle was wrong. I couldn't see a face, not clearly. But the size, the shape, it hit me then, like a punch to the gut. That was Elsie. That thing was carrying Elsie, and Elsie was gone. A wave of nausea rolled over me. I wanted to throw up. I wanted to pass out. I wanted to vanish. But I was still there, in my Ford, staring at this nightmare. And then it moved, slowly, deliberately. It turned its head. At least, I think it was its head. It was hard to tell if it even had a head separate from its body. It was just this bulge on top that turned, and I felt it. Felt it turn towards me, even though I couldn't see any features, no eyes, no face, nothing recognizable, just direction. And it was facing me. It stayed like that for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds, just standing there, still facing me with Elsie dangling in its arms. And then it took a step towards the woods, away from the road. It moved so smoothly, so silently for something so massive. It was like it just glided, stepped off the edge of the road and into the trees, disappearing into the blackness of the forest, taking Elsie with it. I sat there in my Ford, engine idling, rain pouring down, for what felt like a long time. I don't know how long. Minutes, maybe longer. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. Just numb. Eventually, the shivering started. Deep, violent shivers that rattled my teeth and shook the whole car. That jolted me back to something resembling sense. I put the car in drive. Slowly, carefully, I pulled forward, past the spot where it had been. I didn't stop, didn't look back, just kept driving. Faster now, faster and faster, until the Ford was roaring down the highway, tires spraying water, engine screaming, and me just trying to get away, trying to put as much distance as possible between me and that thing. I drove straight to Pinetop, didn't even go home, went straight to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Brody was there, late shift, older guy, seen it all, or so I thought. I stumbled in, soaking wet, shaking like a leaf, and just started rambling about the creature, about Elsie, about the road, the rain, the hair. Everything just poured out of me, jumbled and incoherent. Sheriff Brody, he listened, calm as could be. Just sat there and listened, didn't interrupt, didn't make fun, just let me talk myself out. When I finally ran down, he just nodded slowly, said, "All right, Samuel, let's take a ride." We went back out there in his patrol car. Rain had eased up a bit, but it was still dark and nasty. We drove back to the spot near Beaver Falls. He shined his big spotlight into the woods, along the shoulder of the road, everywhere. We got out, walked around with flashlights, poking around in the ditch, in the trees, found nothing, absolutely nothing. No tracks in the mud, no broken branches, no sign that anything at all had been there, except for my tire tracks on the shoulder. Sheriff Brody, he was patient. He asked me questions, calm questions. Exactly where was it, Samuel? How big would you say it was? What did it look like? I tried to describe it again, but the words just felt flat, meaningless. How do you describe something like that, something that defies description? He listened again, nodding, making notes in a little pad. He didn't say I was crazy. He didn't laugh. But he didn't believe me either, not really. I could see it in his eyes. He thought I'd seen something, sure, maybe a bear in a funny light. Maybe I was just tired, stressed out, imagining things. The rain plays tricks on you out here. He'd said something like that. We drove back to town. He took my statement, wrote it all down, said they'd keep an eye out. For Elsie and, well, I guess for whatever else might be out there, but nothing ever came of it. They searched for Elsie. Rangers, volunteers, the whole town turned out. Searched those woods for days. Found nothing. No Elsie. No body. No sign of her cabin having been disturbed, other than just being empty. Her goats were gone too, just vanished. And then there was Jebediah. Just a few days later, Jebediah Wilson lived over on the other side of the hill from Elsie. Lumberjack, tough as nails, kept to himself. Found dead on his own property. Horrible. Sheriff Brody didn't tell me all the details, but everyone in town heard whispers. Mutilated. Decapitated. Body found one place, head found somewhere else. His dog Blue, a big old hound, was guarding the body, wouldn't let anyone near, growling and snapping. They had to call the vet to sedate him to get to Jebediah. They investigated Jebediah's death, of course. Said it couldn't have been an animal attack. Not a bear, not a cougar. Nothing they knew of could have done something like that. They talked about a man. A crazy man, maybe. Someone who'd gone off the deep end. But nobody had seen anything, heard anything. No witnesses. Just Jebediah dead. And Elsie gone. And me. And what I saw on the highway that night. I told Sheriff Brody about that too. about seeing the creature. He listened, politely, but I could tell. He didn't connect it to Jebediah, didn't connect it to Elsie, not really. He thought it was separate, or just in my head. And maybe it was. Maybe it was just the rain, the dark, the tiredness playing tricks on me. Maybe I just imagined it all. Maybe Elsie just wandered off somewhere and Jebediah, well, maybe Jebediah just had a run-in with someone nasty. Crazy things happen. Out here in the woods, you never know. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. That cold, that dread, that thing in the dark, holding something dead. I still drive that stretch of highway sometimes, going to Sweet Home, coming back, day or night, rain or shine. And every time I come to that bend in the road near Beaver Falls, I slow down. I look, just for a second, just to make sure. Because sometimes when it's really dark and the rain is coming down hard, I can still see it in my headlights, standing there at the edge of the woods, waiting. And I swear, sometimes I can almost smell that cold, that death smell. And I remember the hair, grey hair, hanging limp. And I just drive faster. And I don't stop. I don't ever stop. And I try not to think about what else might be out there in the woods, in the dark, that we don't see, that we can't explain. That just is. And I still can't explain it to this day. What I saw that night, it wasn't of this world. Story 14. The summer of '67. Oregon was on fire, or at least that's how it felt. Not actual fire, thankfully, but the kind of heat that just sits heavy and sticky on you, making everything move slower. Beaver Creek was our go-to spot to escape it, us being, well, me and a few others from school. Mostly it was the boys. Mark, who was always the loudest, and Danny, a bit quieter but always ready to jump in on whatever Mark was doing. Then there was Lisa. She was my closest friend back then, always giggling and full of energy. I was never really one for diving right into the water like them. Too much splashing, too much noise. I preferred just being near it, so there I was, perched on this old picnic table that was probably there since forever, right by the creek's edge. The wood was warm under my hands, and the air hummed with cicadas and the sound of the creek bubbling over the rocks. The others were already in the water, yelling and carrying on, dunking each other and pretending to be pirates or whatever dumb thing came to mind. I wasn't really paying them much attention, to be honest. My mind was just drifting. School was out, finally, and even though summer vacation felt endless, I already had this little knot of worry inside about going back in the fall. Sophomore year was coming up. Just the thought of those crowded hallways, those classrooms, it made me feel a bit closed in. Being out there by the creek, with the sun and the trees all around, that was the opposite. That felt open. Free, almost. That's when I saw them. My eyes had been wandering, just taking in the trees across the creek. They were thick, real thick, like a wall of green and brown. Summer in Oregon, everything was so intensely green. And then something in that green wasn't quite right. At first I thought it was just shadows playing tricks. The sun was filtering down through the leaves, making these dappled patterns, moving and shifting. But there, just at the edge of the woods, where the trees got really dense and the undergrowth was like a tangled mess, I saw something darker. It was like 2 points of absolute blackness in all that green and sunlight, like someone had punched holes in the shadows. I squinted, thinking maybe it was an animal. Deer were common around Beaver Creek. Maybe a bear, though bears usually stayed further up in the mountains. But these didn't look like animal eyes. They were different. They were too dark, too intense, and they were just staring, just locked on me. I stopped breathing. I think I actually stopped breathing. My heart started doing this weird thump-thump thing in my chest, like a trapped bird trying to get out. I forced myself to focus, to really look. It wasn't just eyes. Slowly, shapes started to come out of the shadows around them. There was a kind of movement in the bushes right behind these eyes, like something was holding them open, parting the branches to get a better look at me. That's when I realized These weren't animal eyes at all. They were eyes belonging to something else. They were too human, but not human. That's the only way I can explain it. Human-shaped, maybe, but wrong. So wrong. They were set too deep, and the blackness in them was too consuming, like they were sucking in all the light around them. And the way they were watching me, it wasn't curious. It wasn't even like watching prey, the way an animal might. It was something colder than that, something calculating, like it was figuring me out piece by piece. I just froze, completely, utterly frozen. My mind went blank. Everything around me, the creek, my friends splashing, the sun, even the buzzing of the cicadas, it all faded out. There was only those eyes, and me, and this feeling that was just pure, raw terror. I don't know how long it lasted. It felt like forever, like I was stuck in that moment, staring into those eyes, and nothing else in the world mattered. But then something inside me just snapped. It was like a dam breaking. The terror that had paralyzed me suddenly turned into something else, something explosive. I screamed, not a little gasp, not a yelp, a full-on, lung-emptying, primal scream. It tore through the quiet afternoon. It ripped its way out of me, raw and ragged, and it just kept going. Everything exploded back into sound and motion. The creek rushed back louder than before. The cicadas screamed in my ears, and suddenly my friends were there. They were out of the water in a flash, scrambling up the bank, soaking wet and looking wild-eyed. Mark was first, his face all red and confused. "Sarah, what is it? What happened?" Lisa was right behind him, her eyes huge. Danny was last, still dripping, his hair plastered to his forehead. They were all looking at me like I'd lost my mind. I couldn't speak. I wanted to, but my throat had closed up. My whole body was shaking, vibrating like a plucked string. I couldn't even breathe right. Just these ragged gasps. I could only point. I just kept pointing, my arm shaking towards the woods, towards where I'd seen it. "What? What are you pointing at?" Mark was yelling now, his voice sharp with panic. He was scanning the trees, his eyes darting back and forth. Danny and Lisa were doing the same, their faces pale, but there was nothing there anymore. Just the trees, just the leaves rustling in the breeze, sunlight dappling the forest floor, normal woods. It was gone, whatever it was. They kept asking me, what was it? What did I see? But I couldn't get the words out. My mouth felt like it was full of cotton. My tongue was thick and clumsy. Lisa finally put her arm around me. She was shivering too, even though it was still hot out. "Come on, Sarah," she said, her voice softer now. "Let's get out of here. Let's go to Brock's." Brock's was the ice cream parlor in Clatskanie, the little town closest to Beaver Creek. Everyone went to Brock's. It was safe there. It was normal. Mark and Danny were still looking around, kind of nervously now. They hadn't seen anything, but they'd seen my face. They'd heard my scream. They knew something had terrified me. We just walked. We didn't talk. We just walked back to the car, and Mark drove us straight to Clatskanie and Brock's. The bell above the door jangled when we went into Brock's, and the smell of waffle cones and ice cream hit us. It was like stepping back into the real world. Inside, it was cool and bright and noisy, with kids laughing and the soda fountain hissing. Normal, so utterly, blessedly normal. We sat down in a booth in the back. Mr. Brocky came over himself to take our order, probably wondering why we all looked so spooked. Lisa ordered for me a vanilla milkshake. She knew it was my favorite. It took a long time, a really long time. But finally, slowly, the shaking started to ease up. The knot in my stomach started to loosen a little, and the words started to come. It was all jumbled at first. Broken sentences, fragments, eyes, in the woods, watching, dark, so dark. Lisa held my hand. She kept telling me to breathe, to take it slow. Mark and Danny leaned in, their faces serious now, no more joking around. They were listening, really listening. And I told them, I told them about the eyes, about how they'd just appeared in the shadows, staring at me, about how they didn't look like animal eyes, about how they felt wrong, menacing. I described them as best as I could. The deep blackness, the way they were set in the shadows, the feeling of being watched, judged, the pure terror. They listened, faces getting paler and paler. They kept asking questions, trying to make sense of it. Was it an animal, Sarah? Are you sure it wasn't just a deer or something? But I knew. I knew it wasn't an animal. It was something else, something human-like, but not human. Something that didn't belong there, something that had been watching me from the woods. It was holding the branches back, I said, my voice still shaky, like it was making a space to see me better. That made them go quiet, really quiet. Even Mark, who always had something to say, just stared at me, his mouth slightly open. Danny finally spoke, his voice low. "Did you see anything else besides the eyes?" I shook my head. "No, just movement in the bushes, and then when I screamed it was gone, just gone." We sat there in silence for a while, the milkshake cold in my hands, untouched. The noise of Brock's buzzed around us, but it felt distant, muffled, like we were in our own little bubble of fear. Then Lisa said, maybe it was just someone hiding in the woods, playing a prank. It sounded weak, even to her ears. We all knew it wasn't just someone playing a prank. Not with those eyes. Mark tried to sound braver. "We should go back," he said, "to the creek. We should check it out, see if we can find anything." But none of us moved. None of us wanted to go back to Beaver Creek. Not back to those woods. Not after what I'd seen. The rest of the day is kind of a blur. We stayed at Brock's for hours, just talking in hushed voices, going over and over what had happened. We told Mr. Brock we weren't feeling well and needed to stay longer. He just nodded, probably thinking it was teenage drama. Later, Mark and Danny drove me and Lisa home. Everything felt different. The sunlight seemed less bright. The trees looked darker, more menacing. Even the familiar streets of Klatskani felt strange, like something had shifted, something was off. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them. Those eyes in the dark, watching me. And I would jerk awake, my heart pounding, the scream still echoing in my head. The next day, the story got out. It always does in a small town like Klatskani. Lisa told some of her friends, Mark and Danny told some of the other guys, and soon everyone was talking about it. At first, people were skeptical. Sarah saw something in the woods, probably just her imagination, that kind of thing. But then, the stories started. Whispers and rumors passed from person to person, stories of other sightings in the woods around Beaver Creek, strange noises, shadows moving where they shouldn't, feelings of being watched. Suddenly, my story didn't seem so crazy anymore. Suddenly, people started remembering things they'd dismissed or ignored before, that weird rustling in the bushes, that glimpse of something out of the corner of their eye, that cold shiver down their spine for no reason at all, and the fear. It spread like wildfire. Kids stopped going to Beaver Creek. People locked their doors earlier. They looked over their shoulders when they walked through the woods. Summer of '67 was never the same after that day at Beaver Creek. The heat didn't break, but something else did. Something innocent, carefree. I never went back to Beaver Creek. Not really. I drove past it sometimes with my parents, but I never asked them to stop, never wanted to go near those woods again. To this day, I don't know what I saw. I've tried to make sense of it, tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just an animal. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe I just imagined it all, in the heat and the boredom and the summer haze. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. And I know those eyes were real. They were as real as anything I've ever seen, and sometimes late at night, when everything is quiet and dark, I still see them, just for a flicker, just for a second. Those black eyes staring out of the shadows, watching, waiting. And I know, deep down, that whatever it was, whatever I saw that day at Beaver Creek, it's still out there, somewhere in the woods, still watching, still waiting, and I will never, ever forget those eyes. Story 15. We were trying to save some money, me and Michael, my husband. It was back in '88, September. We had this old Bonanza, a real fixer-upper RV we were working on, trying to make it livable for maybe doing some traveling. My uncle, he had this hunting camp up in McKean County, Pennsylvania, way out in the boonies, near this tiny place called Claremont. He said we could park the RV there for a bit while we were getting it ready. You know, instead of paying for a campsite, it sounded perfect, free and quiet. We drove up there one Saturday, and it was late by the time we got to the camp. It was definitely isolated. Uncle's camp was just a small cabin, kind of run down, tucked way back in the woods. We parked the RV maybe 100 feet away from the cabin, next to this scraggly line of trees, more like overgrown bushes, really. It was dark already, proper dark. The kind of dark you only get when you're miles away from any town, when there's no streetlights and barely even any houses. Just trees and more trees. Setting up was a pain in the butt. Leveling the RV was always a nightmare. We were bickering about it as usual, Michael getting frustrated because he could never get it quite right. Eventually, we got it close enough. We were both exhausted and hungry. We heated up some soup on the little propane stove and ate in the cramped kitchen area. It was cozy in a way. We were making it work, this little project of ours. After dinner, Michael crashed almost immediately. He's a heavy sleeper anyway, but that day he was just out. I cleaned up a bit, washed the dishes in that tiny sink, and then just sat at the dinette table, looking out the back window. It was a clear night. The moon was out, not full, but enough to cast these long, weird shadows from the trees around the camp. Everything outside was black and silver, all sharp edges and deep pools of darkness. It was quiet too, except for the crickets chirping and the occasional rustle of leaves. Peaceful almost. I was just thinking about stuff, about life, about whether we were doing the right thing with this RV, about work, everything and nothing. My mind was kind of drifting. I remember feeling really calm, tired but calm, just watching the shadows move in the moonlight. And then I saw it. At first, I thought it was just another shadow playing tricks on my eyes, but it was different. It was over by that line of bushes I mentioned, maybe 15-20 feet from the back window. It was tall, way taller than the bushes, and much, much darker than any shadow. It was solid black, like a void in the moonlight. It was just standing there, still, upright. My heart did this weird jump thing in my chest, like it was trying to get out. I squinted, trying to make sense of it, trying to tell myself it was a tree or a weirdly shaped bush or anything but what my gut was screaming at me it was. It was a figure. A dark figure standing in the trees, watching the RV, watching me. It was huge, way bigger than a person. I'm not exaggerating, it looked like it was at least 7 feet tall, maybe more, and it was broad, thick, not like a skinny shadow person, but solid. My breath hitched. I couldn't move. I was frozen, staring, my eyes glued to this thing. Then it moved. Slowly, deliberately, it took a step forward towards the RV, and another, and another. Each step was heavy. I could almost feel the vibration even through the RV floor, though I didn't hear anything. It was like watching something move in slow motion. But also, it was coming closer, getting bigger, filling my vision. Panic kicked in, real, cold, paralyzing panic. My brain finally caught up with what my eyes were seeing. This wasn't a shadow. This wasn't a trick of the light. This was something else, something wrong. I had to wake Michael. I had to get out of there. My hands started shaking so bad I could barely form a fist. I tried to yell, but my voice was just a choked whisper. I started kicking the bed, hard, over and over. "Michael! Michael! Wake up!" I was hissing, trying to keep my voice down somehow, even though every instinct screamed to scream. My eyes never left the figure outside. It was closer now, right at the edge of the bushes. Michael grunted, rolled over. What? He was still half asleep, mumbling into the pillow. "Michael, wake up! There's something outside! Something bad!" I was shaking him now, grabbing his shoulder and yanking him. He finally sat up, rubbing his eyes, looking totally confused and annoyed. "Liz, what the hell? What's wrong? Just look! Look out the window! Hurry!" I was pointing, my arm shaking so violently I could barely keep it aimed. He turned, still groggy, and looked out the back window. For a second he just blinked. Then I saw his eyes widen, the sleep instantly wiped clean from his face. He saw it. He saw it too. The figure was right there now, just a few feet from the window. It had come out of the bushes, into the open. The moonlight was hitting it more directly now, and I could see details. Oh God, the details. It was still dark, mostly black, but not just a solid silhouette anymore. It was covered in hair, long, shaggy, dark hair, like an animal, but not like any animal I'd ever seen. It was standing upright, completely upright, like a man, but wrong. And its face, I could see its face, vaguely human shape, but twisted, distorted, covered in that same dark hair. And its eyes were glowing, not like shining, but like they were lit from inside, a sickly yellow glow, burning, staring right at me. It was the eyes that really got to me. They were intelligent, knowing, like it understood everything I was feeling, every ounce of fear, and it was enjoying it. I was making these small, whimpering sounds without even realizing it. My whole body was trembling, not just from fear, but from revulsion. This thing was unnatural, wrong on a level I couldn't even comprehend. Michael was beside me now, standing frozen, staring. He didn't say anything, just stood there like a statue, his face white in the dim RV light. I could feel his fear radiating off him, matching my own. The creature started to move again. Slowly, deliberately, it leaned forward, bending at the waist, closer, closer, until its face was right up against the window. Its snout, maybe, muzzle. Whatever it was pressed against the glass, inches from my face. I could see more detail now, even closer. The hair was coarse, matted in places. Its skin underneath looked grayish, almost like dead flesh. Its nose was flat and wide, with slits for nostrils. And its teeth. I could see its teeth, even in the dim light. Long, pointed, yellowed, like a predator's teeth. The smell hit me then. It was faint, but unmistakable. A thick, musky animal smell, like wet dog, but stronger, fouler, mixed with something else, something rotten. I couldn't breathe. I felt like I was going to pass out. The eyes were still fixed on me, burning, intense. It felt like it was looking into my soul, stripping me bare. I had to do something, anything. My mind was screaming, scrambling for any kind of escape, any way to break this nightmare. I saw the blanket, a heavy wool blanket we kept folded on the dinette seat. My hand shot out, grabbed it, pulled it to me. Without thinking, without planning, I just reacted. I threw the blanket, I hurled it with all my might at the back window. It smacked against the glass with a dull thud, right in the face of that thing. And then it was gone. Just like that. 1 second it was there, its face pressed against the glass, its eyes burning into me, and the next, nothing. Empty space. Just the dark woods and the silver moonlight filtering through the trees. For a second, I just stood there, frozen again, clutching the blanket to my chest, staring at the empty window. Had I imagined it? Was it all just some horrible hallucination brought on by tiredness and stress? Then I heard it. The sound. Heavy footsteps, crashing through the underbrush, moving away from the RV, deeper into the woods, fast, heavy, definitely not human. I scrambled back from the window, stumbling, tripping over my own feet. I slammed into Michael, who was still standing there, petrified. I grabbed his arm, digging my fingers into his flesh. "Did you see it? Did you see it, Michael? Tell me you saw it." My voice was a hysterical whisper, barely audible. He nodded slowly, his eyes wide and haunted. Yeah, I saw it. What the hell was that?" I don't know, but it was right there. I was pointing wildly at the window, even though there was nothing there now, just the dark woods. But I could still feel it, feel its presence, lingering in the air, even though it was gone. We didn't sleep that night. Not a wink. We huddled together on the dinette seats, wrapped in blankets, every nerve screaming. We kept the lights on, all the lights, even though it drained the RV battery. We listened to every sound outside, every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, jumping at shadows, expecting it to come back. But it didn't. Or maybe it did, lurking out there in the darkness, watching us, waiting. I don't know. All I know is that I didn't close my eyes, not for a second. Every shadow looked like that figure. Every rustle of leaves sounded like heavy footsteps. The night stretched on forever, a black hole of terror. When the first hint of dawn finally started to lighten the sky, I felt a tiny sliver of relief. But it was still there, that fear, clinging to me like a second skin. As soon as it was properly light, we got out of that RV. We didn't even make coffee. We just threw on some clothes, grabbed our keys and got out. We walked around the RV, half expecting to see footprints or broken branches or something, anything, to prove to ourselves that it had been real. But there was nothing. Just the normal forest floor, leaves, pine needles, dirt. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing disturbed. It was like it had vanished into thin air, leaving no trace. Michael, he kept saying it was probably just a bear. Or a deer, maybe, standing on its hind legs in the shadows. He was trying to rationalize it, to make it make sense, but he didn't believe it. I could see it in his eyes. He was scared, too. And I knew, deep down, what I'd seen. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a deer. It was something else, something wrong, something that shouldn't exist. We packed up the RV as fast as we could, not even bothering to level it properly this time. We just wanted to get out of there, out of those woods, away from that place. We never went back to Uncle's hunting camp. We finished fixing up the RV at a different location, closer to civilization. We even sold it a few years later. I just couldn't stand being in it anymore. Every time I looked out the back window, I saw that figure standing there in the dark, those glowing eyes staring back at me. Michael, he tries not to talk about it. He says it was probably just stress, sleep deprivation, our imaginations running wild. But sometimes, late at night, when he thinks I'm asleep, I hear him get up and look out the window. He never admits it, but I know he remembers it too. He remembers the fear. He remembers the eyes. And me. I still see it sometimes when I close my eyes. That face pressed against the glass. Those burning yellow eyes. The smell. The feeling of pure, primal terror. I don't know what it was. I don't want to know. Some things are better left in the shadows, hidden in the dark corners of the woods. But I know one thing for sure. There are things out there in the world that we don't understand. Things that are not supposed to be. And sometimes, if you're unlucky, they find you, and they watch you, and you'll never be the same again. I know I'm not. Not after that night in the woods. Not after seeing that thing. I can't explain it. And I'm glad it just left. I still get chills thinking about what could have happened if it hadn't just disappeared.